Section 1. The World That Never Was. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a wasteland at night. Not the silence of peace or rest, but something thicker. A silence that carries weight. The kind that belongs to places where too much has already happened, where the ground itself has absorbed decades of grief and ash, and where the stars overhead are just bright enough to remind you that the universe doesn't particularly care about any of it. That's the world of Fallout, and we're going to spend some time there tonight. Get comfortable. Let the tension leave your shoulders, because what I'm about to do is walk you through the deepest, most atmospheric corners of one of gaming's most richly imagined universes. We're going to explore the mysteries that the games never fully explain, the histories written in terminal logs and half-burned holotapes, the characters whose stories stretch across decades of fiction without ever fully resolving. We're going to let those stories wash over you slowly, the way a good mystery should, not with urgency, but with the quiet wonder of someone piecing together a puzzle by firelight. So, let's begin at the beginning. Or rather, let's begin before the beginning. Long before a single bomb fell, long before the first ghoul shuffled through the ruins of what had been a thriving civilization, the world of Fallout diverged from our own. The exact moment of divergence is one that the games themselves leave deliberately vague, a kind of fracture point somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, after which history took a different road and never looked back. In our world, the post-war years brought transistors and microchips, the digital revolution, the internet, the slow and chaotic shift away from fossil fuels. In the world of Fallout, none of that happened. The transistor was developed, yes, but the miniaturization that led to the personal computer never materialized in quite the same way. Instead, the technology of the 1950s scaled up rather than scaling down. Vacuum tubes kept their dominance. Television stayed bulbous and cathode ray warm. Cars became enormous, chrome-plated, almost obscenely beautiful machines that ran on fusion cells. Robots were built with the aesthetic sensibility of a 1950s science fair project. Rounded shoulders, glowing eyes, cheerful recorded voices saying things like, "How can I help you today?" while armed with flamethrowers. The art of this world has a name that Fallout scholars like to use: atompunk. A vision of the future as imagined by someone in 1955, exuberant and optimistic on the surface, with the barely concealed terror of nuclear annihilation humming just beneath the polish. Vault Boy with his perky thumbs up. The Pip-Boy strapped to your wrist like the world's most cheerful piece of surveillance equipment. Nuka-Cola, carbonated and faintly irradiated, in a bottle designed to look like an atomic mushroom. Every element of the Fallout world is that particular strain of retrofuturism, the future as it was imagined before we found out what the future actually looked like. But there's something crucial about the Fallout world that goes beyond mere aesthetic. This is a world that never found a way out of its addiction to oil. By the mid-21st century, petroleum reserves had been declining for decades in both the real world and the Fallout world. But where our world fumbled toward renewables and alternative energies with mixed success, the Fallout world stayed on the same road. They built fusion-powered vehicles, yes, and they had some nuclear plants, but the economy, the culture, the political structure of that world remained fundamentally organized around petroleum. And as petroleum grew scarce, the wars that had always been present, the kind fought in the dark where official rhetoric wouldn't reach, grew louder. The resource wars began in 2052. That's the shorthand the history books use, though by that point the fighting had been building for years. The European Commonwealth invaded the Middle East in search of oil. The United States, watching its own fuel supplies dwindle, turned its gaze west across the Pacific toward China. And China, having its own vast population and its own desperate resource needs, had been eyeing Alaska for years. In 2066, China invaded Alaska. Think about that for a moment. An actual invasion of American territory. Not a proxy conflict, not a covert operation, but Chinese forces moving across the Bering Land Bridge and establishing themselves in the frozen tundra of America's northernmost state. The United States responded with everything it had, including the eventual deployment of powered armor, those iconic green suits that appear in every Fallout game, the T-45 model being the first to see combat. The Anchorage front became legendary, brutal, mythologized almost immediately. American soldiers fighting in sub-zero conditions against a technologically sophisticated enemy, with the propaganda machine back home painting it as a heroic struggle for national survival. The Anchorage front was eventually liberated in 2077, less than a year before the end of everything. By that point, the world had been rearranging itself into hostile blocks for years. The United Nations had dissolved in 2052. International law had become a polite fiction. Major corporations companies like Vault-Tec, Robco Industries, General Atomics International, Nuka-Cola Corporation had grown so entwined with government that the distinction between public and private power had essentially ceased to exist. These companies didn't just lobby, they planned, they prepared, they knew what was coming, or they thought they did, and they positioned themselves accordingly. Vault-Tec we'll discuss at length shortly, but for now, just understand the texture of the world in those final years. Cities were tense, rationing was in effect. Anti-Chinese sentiment had been carefully cultivated by a government that needed a foreign enemy to focus public anger on. Propaganda was everywhere on the radio, in magazines, in the cheerful instructional films produced by Vault-Tec, showing happy families descending into their assigned vaults with relief on their faces and hope in their hearts. And then the 23rd of October, 2077, a Tuesday, nobody knows exactly who fired first. That mystery is one of the deepest in the entire Fallout universe, and we'll come back to it at the end of this video when we've had time to lay out all the context it needs. But the exchange was rapid. 2 hours, from the first launch to the last. The missiles crossed each other's paths in the high atmosphere, a deadly choreography that neither side had planned, but both had known was always possible. 2 hours, and it was over. 2 hours, and the world that had existed for tens of thousands of years of human civilization was simply gone. What remained was everything we know from the games. The cracked asphalt of highways that still stretch toward cities that no longer exist. The hollow shells of diners where neon signs still flicker, still advertising the blue plate special to a clientele that burned 2 centuries ago. The Pip-Boys, the plasma rifles, the power armor suits standing empty in forgotten military bases, waiting for someone to fill them again. The vaults, sealed beneath the earth, each one containing a piece of humanity and a secret that its residents didn't know about. And out in the wasteland, in the ruins of everything, people, survivors and their descendants, ghouls who walked through the fire and came out changed, super mutants who never asked to become what they are. Merchants moving between settlements along broken roads, raiders who gave up on the idea of civilization, decided to take what they needed instead, and the scattered, stubborn, sometimes noble, sometimes terrible attempts to build something new from the rubble of something old. Fallout asks a question with every game, sometimes explicitly, sometimes not. The question is this: does humanity deserve a second chance? The answer, across all the games, is complicated. It's probably yes, but the evidence for yes is harder to find than you might expect, because the evidence for no is lying in the foundations of everything. Before the bombs fell, the people in charge of the world made choices, and those choices made in boardrooms and government offices and military installations echo through every settlement and every ruin and every half-understood tradition that the children of the wasteland carry forward, without knowing exactly what they mean. The world of Fallout is a ghost. It haunts itself. And tonight, we're going to walk through it together. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is there. There's something special about knowing people are settling in for this from all different corners of the planet. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. There's a lot more where this is coming from. Section 2. The Vaults, Humanity's Most Elaborate Lie. Let's talk about the vaults. On the surface, and I mean that both literally and figuratively, the vaults were exactly what they appeared to be. Enormous underground shelters, designed to protect a portion of the American population from nuclear war. Vault-Tec built them. The government commissioned them. The advertising campaign was cheerful, relentless, and effective. Families signed up. They paid their fees. They were assigned numbers. They were told that when the sirens sounded, they should go to their assigned vault, bring only what they could carry, and wait for the all-clear. It was one of the most successful marketing campaigns in history, and also one of the most elaborate deceptions ever perpetrated on a civilian population. Because the vaults weren't built to save anyone. Or rather, saving people was a side effect, an incidental byproduct. What the vaults were really built for was something else entirely. Here is what we know, pieced together from documents scattered across 6 games, from terminal entries and holotapes and the confessions of people who no longer had any reason to hide the truth. Vault-Tec was contracted by the United States government to build the vaults under a program called Project Safehouse. The official purpose was survival. The unofficial purpose, known to executives at both Vault-Tec and the highest levels of the federal government, was research. Specifically, research into human behavior under extreme conditions, research into social engineering, research into what happens when you take a cross-section of American society, seal them underground with carefully calibrated variables, and observe the results. The vaults, in other words, were laboratories, and the people inside them were the subjects. Only a handful of vaults were built as genuine shelters, with no experimental variable, the so-called control vaults, designed to give the other experiments a baseline for comparison. Every other vault had a purpose, and the purposes ranged from the merely strange to the genuinely horrifying. Let's move through some of them, slowly, and let the scope of what was done settle over you like dust. Vault 11, located in the Mojave Desert, was the kind of experiment that sounds almost philosophical until you understand what it actually meant for the people inside. The residents of Vault 11 were given a single instruction by their vault's overseer system. Each year, they must choose one person from among their number to be sacrificed. If they failed to produce their annual sacrifice, the AI running the vault would kill everyone inside. Now, there was never going to be a good way to handle this. But what makes Vault 11 so extraordinary isn't just the brutality of the requirement, it's what the residents did in response to it. Rather than descending immediately into chaos, the people of Vault 11 built a society. They formed political factions. They developed elaborate ideological frameworks to govern who would be selected each year. Some argued for volunteers. Some argued for criminals and undesirables. Some argued for random selection to ensure fairness. Elections were held. Campaigns were run. People made promises they couldn't keep to avoid being the one chosen. Over time, the political culture of Vault 11 became a warped mirror of American democracy, complete with corruption, demagoguery, and the willingness to sacrifice the least powerful members of society to protect the comfort of the most powerful. This went on for decades. The sacrifice became routine. The ideology that justified it became more sophisticated with each generation, as people who had been born into the system tried to make sense of the only world they'd ever known. And then, after more than 70 years of annual sacrifice, the political structure of Vault 11 collapsed. A group of armed residents overthrew the overseer who had been managing the selection process. And in the aftermath, with only 5 residents remaining from what had once been a full community, those 5 faced a choice: produce the last sacrifice or refuse. They refused. The AI spoke to them. It told them that by refusing to sacrifice one of their own, they had demonstrated something the experiment was designed to measure. They were told, in the cold language of a system that had been watching them for nearly a century, that they were shining examples of humanity. And then it told them the truth. The threat had never been real. The annual sacrifice had never been required for anything. It was the experiment. The whole time, it was just the experiment. 3 of the 5 survivors killed themselves immediately after learning this. The horror of what they had done, what their parents and grandparents had done, what the entire community had done across 3 generations crushed them in an instant. The recordings you find in Vault 11 are among the most devastating pieces of writing in any video game. Not because they're dramatic or cinematic, but because they're quiet. They're the voice of someone who has lived their whole life inside a system designed to consume them, and who only understands this at the very end. Vault 12 in Bakersfield, California, was the one that built a city. Vault 12 was designed with a single modification from the standard vault template. The door was never meant to fully seal. Radiation would leak in. The residents would be exposed. And over time, the experiment would measure what happened to a human population subject to chronic radiation exposure. The answer, which the games document in considerable detail, is that some people die, but some people transform into something else. Something that looks human but isn't quite, something that can survive in conditions that would kill an unmodified person. What the world of Fallout calls ghouls. The survivors of Vault 12, the ones who didn't die outright, the ones whose biology adapted in ways that Vault-Tec scientists had theorized but never confirmed, built their own settlement on the surface. They called it Necropolis, City of the Dead, a name that carries both pride and grief, the kind of name that says, "We know what we look like to you and we've decided to own it." The ghouls of Necropolis are long gone by the time of the first Fallout game, their city destroyed by a force we'll discuss in another section. But they matter because they represent something important. The vaults didn't just produce experiments. They produced cultures, they produced peoples. The post-apocalyptic world is populated by the descendants of experimental subjects, each culture shaped by the particular horror their vault was designed to inflict. Vault 68 was populated with exactly 999 men and 1 woman. Not a misprint, not a glitch. That was the experiment to observe what happens to gender dynamics and social structure in an extreme demographic imbalance. The results, as you might imagine, were not encouraging. Vault 87, in the capital wasteland of what had been the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, was used as an FEV research facility. The forced evolutionary virus, which we'll explore in its own section later, was tested on the residents of Vault 87 as part of the evolutionary experimentation program. The people who entered Vault 87 believing they would be safe from nuclear fire were instead used as raw material for the creation of supermutants, their bodies, their DNA, their humanity, all of it consumed by an experiment in biological transformation. Vault 112, buried deep in the capital wasteland, contains perhaps the most quietly disturbing scenario in the entire Fallout universe. Its residents who entered the vault alive, who breathed and ate, and thought were placed in tranquility loungers, reclining pods designed to interface with a sophisticated virtual reality system, and in that virtual reality system, they lived. They lived in a simulation of a 1950s American suburb, a place called Tranquility Lane, where the houses were bright and the lawns were green, and the neighbors waved from their front porches. They forgot over time what was real. They forgot they were underground. They forgot the bombs had fallen. They forgot they were wearing simulation helmets in a vault that had been sealed for 2 centuries. They forgot because a man named Dr. Stanislaus Braun wanted them to forget. We'll spend more time in Vault 112 in a later section, because the story of Tranquility Lane deserves more than a few sentences. It's the kind of story that gets under your skin slowly. The way cold does, you don't notice how deeply it's reached until you try to move. Vault 81 was designed to test medical treatments on a captive population, specifically cures for every disease known to humanity, administered through the air and water systems without the residents' knowledge. The scientist assigned to run the program had a crisis of conscience and sabotaged most of it, which is why Vault 81, when the player finds it in Fallout 4, is one of the few functional vaults that has managed to maintain a stable community. The experiment failed, mostly. The people survived, mostly. One mutated mole rat disease escaped containment and persisted in the lower levels. But given what was planned for Vault 81, that's almost a victory. Vault 101, the vault in which the player begins Fallout 3, had an experiment deceptively simple in its cruelty. The door was never supposed to open. Not ever. Not when the war was over, not when the radiation cleared, not at any point. The vault was designed to remain sealed indefinitely. The residents were to be told, generation after generation, that the outside world was still too dangerous. And the experiment wasn't really about the sealed door, it was about the overseer. Specifically about what happens to authority in a closed system from which there is no appeal and no alternative. What kind of leader does an overseer become when they know the door will never open and that their power can never be meaningfully challenged? The answer Vault 101 eventually arrived at was the kind of leader who shoots his own daughter's friends and orders exile for people who ask the wrong questions. Vault 21, in the heart of what had been Las Vegas, had a different approach entirely. In Vault 21, all disputes from resource allocation to relationship conflicts to leadership selection were settled by gambling. Whatever you wanted, you had to win it. Whatever you owed, you had to pay in chips. Mr. House, when he eventually took control of the New Vegas Strip, had the vault filled with concrete. He didn't want competition. Now, why any of this? Why would a government design its own fallout shelters as experiments rather than genuine refuges? The answer, which is scattered across the Fallout universe in fragments, goes back to a project beyond Vault-Tec's official mandate. The Enclave, the remnant of the pre-war federal government, operating in secret from offshore oil rigs and military installations, believed that nuclear war was not only survivable, but perhaps even desirable as a kind of reset. They planned for a world afterward, a world that they would control. To control a world after nuclear war, you need 2 things: You need data about human behavior under extreme stress, so you can predict and manage post-war populations. And you need a supply of clean humans, people whose genetic material hasn't been contaminated by radiation, to form the seed of whatever new civilization you intend to build. The vaults provided both. The experiments generated the data, and a handful of carefully selected vaults, the ones without modification, the control vaults provided the clean genetic stock. This is the truth at the bottom of Vault-Tec's cheerful promotional material. This is what the smiling Vault Boy is smiling about. Not safety, not hope, the quiet satisfaction of a plan proceeding exactly as intended. The people of the pre-war world signed up for survival and were handed an experiment. Their children were born into it, their grandchildren were shaped by it, and 200 years later, their great-great-grandchildren are walking through wastelands they didn't create, carrying the psychological and genetic legacy of decisions made before their existence was even a possibility. There is something in that lineage, in the particular cruelty of it, that makes the Fallout universe feel heavier than most post-apocalyptic fiction. It's not just that the world ended. It's that the world was allowed to end because the people who could have prevented it were busy planning what came next. Section 3. The Dunwich Enigma, Cosmic Horror Beneath the Wasteland. There is a building in the capital wasteland that doesn't make sense. It sits in an isolated corner of the map, away from roads and settlements and the usual landmarks that organize the post-war landscape. There's no obvious reason to go there. No quest points you in its direction initially. It doesn't offer exceptional loot or significant story relevance to the main plotline. It just sits, alone, in a stretch of barren terrain where even the usual wasteland wildlife seems reluctant to linger. The Dunwich Building. If you've played Fallout 3, you know the feeling of approaching it. Something registers as wrong before you can articulate what. The silence is different from the usual wasteland silence. It has a quality to it, not emptiness but pressure, as if the air is slightly denser here than elsewhere. The ruined structure ahead has the shape of an office building, ordinary enough by post-war standards. But there's something about the angles that doesn't quite resolve correctly in your vision, a subtle wrongness that you keep trying to dismiss as a trick of the light. You go inside. The building is populated by feral ghouls. That alone isn't remarkable. Feral ghouls occupy dozens of locations throughout the capital wasteland. But the ghouls in the Dunwich Building don't behave quite like the others. They're not simply aggressive and territorial. They seem to be oriented towards something, moving in patterns that, if you pay attention, appear to orbit a common point somewhere deep within the building. You follow the pattern downward, through ruined floors, past overturned filing cabinets and collapsed ceilings, deeper into the earth beneath the building's foundations. And there, in the lowest accessible level, you find what the ghouls have been circling. A black obelisk. It's not large, perhaps 1.5 meters in height. It doesn't glow or pulse or produce any visual effect that the game engine renders as supernatural. It simply stands in the dimness of the vault-like chamber beneath the building. And it is wrong in a way that doesn't yield to any of the usual explanatory frameworks the Fallout universe provides. There is a voice near the obelisk, very quiet, repeating words if you stand still long enough to hear them. The name Al-Hazred, which, if you recognize it, sends a cold thread through the back of your mind, because Abdul Al-Hazred is the author, in H.P. Lovecraft's mythology, of the Necronomicon, and also the word Gieth, which appears in the Cthulhu mythos as a term for the servants of elder gods. There are audio logs in the building. They tell the story of a man named Jaime and of the building's history. The Dunwich Building belonged to Dunwich Borers LLC, a company whose business officially was construction and excavation. But Jamie's recordings suggest a different purpose. His family has a long connection to this place. His father brought a book, an old book, older than it should be, with properties that defy straightforward description, and left it here. Jaime came to find the book and found instead that the building itself had changed him, was changing him, in ways he couldn't stop. His last recording is almost incoherent. He's repeating the same names, the voice near the obelisk whispers. He's gone somewhere that has nothing to do with physical location. The book Jaime's father brought connects to a quest in the Point Lookout DLC called The Dark Heart of Blackhall. In that quest, you recover an ancient tome called the Kriv Bekni from an old man named Obadiah Blackhall, whose family name, combined with everything else, is another deliberate signal. The Kriv Bekni is described as a book of immense and malevolent power. The only way to destroy it, according to the relevant lore, is to bring it to the obelisk beneath the Dunwich building and press it against the stone. Which means the obelisk isn't just a strange artifact, it has properties. It can destroy something that cannot otherwise be destroyed. Which raises the question of what created it, and how long it has been there, and what entity or force it might be dedicated to. The name that Fallout lore scholars have assembled from scattered fragments is Ugg-Qualtoth, not a demon in the conventional sense. Not a deity in the way that word is usually used. Something older and stranger than either category can quite contain an entity from the tradition Lovecraft codified, and which Bethesda was clearly drawing on when they designed everything connected to the Dunwich name. Now, Fallout 4 takes this thread and follows it further, in a location called the Dunwich Borers. On the surface, the Dunwich Borers is a marble quarry. A raider outpost has taken root there, and it looks at first like any number of other locations: ruined industrial equipment, hostile occupants, some loot worth picking through. But if you go deeper, below the surface workings, into the actual excavation site, you begin to encounter something else. Holotapes left by the company's project managers, recordings from before the war documenting what the excavation was really for, stations scattered through the dig site that, when you approach them, trigger brief visions, flashbacks, experienced by your character of events that happened here decades ago. In one of these flashbacks, a robed figure stands before kneeling people who are bound at the wrists. The figure holds a knife. The scene has the quality of something from a very old kind of religion. The people kneeling are wearing the faces of the workers who appear in the company's records. You return to reality in the present day and find that those same workers have become feral ghouls, still here, still oriented toward the depths of the excavation, still serving something they can no longer name. And at the very bottom of the Dunwich Borers, you find what the company was digging toward, a pool of dark liquid, and rising from that pool, only partially exposed by the excavation, something that might be a face vast, stone, ancient, partially submerged in whatever that liquid is. A crane has been positioned above the pool, suggesting that whoever was running the excavation intended to eventually lift the thing out. They ran out of time. The bombs fell first. The thing in the pool is presumably a representation of Ugg-Qualtoth, or perhaps not a representation at all, but the actual physical presence of something that existed long before the first human civilization, and that will exist long after the last human civilization has concluded. The Dunwich Borers LLC, a seemingly mundane construction company, was in fact a front, a corporate body organized around a specific religious purpose: to uncover and liberate something that had been buried, something that a family named Dunwich had been serving for generations. The obelisk in the Dunwich building, the Creve-Beckney and the Blackhall family, the Dunwich Borers quarry and the thing in its depths. These are not separate threads. They are the same thread, running through the entire history of the Fallout universe, suggesting that beneath the very explicable horrors of the post-war world, the radiation, the FEV, the political violence, the social collapse, there is something else. Something for which neither radiation nor political theory nor evolutionary biology offers any kind of framework. What's most interesting about the Dunwich mystery is what Bethesda chose not to do with it. They chose not to explain it. The Fallout games provide extensive lore for almost everything: the creation of super mutants, the history of the Brotherhood of Steel, the founding of New Vegas, the mechanics of ghoulification, but the Dunwich entity, the obelisk, the Creve-Beckney, the stone face in the pool, these receive no scientific explanation. No character in the games attempts to analyze them in terms the Fallout world can usually accommodate. And that's the right choice. Because some things in a world, even a fictional one, should not be reducible to game mechanics and exposition. Some things should remain in the register of dread, that uncomfortable zone where the mind reaches for explanation and finds only more darkness. The Dunwich building is the wasteland's way of reminding you that not everything that survived the bombs was human in origin. Not everything that waits in the dark is waiting because the war made it that way. Some things were waiting long before that. There is a popular concept in horror literature called the unreliable world. The moment when a narrative signals to you that the rules you thought governed the story don't actually apply. That your assumptions about causality and explanation have been quietly invalidated. The Dunwich mystery does exactly this to the Fallout universe. It's a hole in the fabric, and through that hole, something very old is watching. Section 4. The Mysterious Stranger, a ghost across the wasteland. He's been there from the very beginning. In the original Fallout, released in 1997, players who chose the Mysterious Stranger perk during character creation would occasionally find, during combat, that a stranger appeared out of nowhere to fire a killing shot at their enemies and then vanished before the combat was over. He couldn't be talked to. He couldn't be identified. He came, he fired, he left. Sometimes he died in the original game. If he caught a stray bullet, that was it. He wouldn't appear again. But usually he survived. Usually he just disappeared. Every sequel has brought him back. Fallout 2, 3, New Vegas, 4, 76, even Fallout Shelter. He's been a fixture of the series longer than almost any other element, more consistent than any specific faction or geography, more reliable than any recurring character. He shows up with his long coat and his hat and his revolver. He does what he came to do, and he's gone before you can turn around. Who is he? The honest answer is that the Fallout games don't tell you. His identity is treated as genuinely, deliberately unknowable, which, in a universe that explains almost everything eventually, is a striking choice. The word mysterious in his name isn't a tease, it's a statement of intent. But the games do leave clues, and those clues, layered across 20-plus years of installments, paint a portrait that is both more specific and more strange than you might expect. Let's start with what he looks like. From Fallout 3 onward, the mysterious stranger is described consistently as a young man of Asian descent, wearing a long trench coat in the style of 1940s film noir and a hat that sits low over his face. His weapon is a revolver, the mysterious Magnum, which fires with a distinctive sound effect that the game plays every time he appears. That sound is a guitar sting. A few ascending notes in a Western musical idiom, the kind of sound that in classic films signaled the arrival of the gunslinger. The man who rides in from nowhere, does what needs doing, and moves on before anyone can ask his name. In Fallout, New Vegas, there is a character you can encounter in the Mojave Wasteland called the Lonesome Drifter. He's a traveling musician, down on his luck, playing guitar on a hilltop in the middle of nowhere. If you talk to him, and if your character is male, and if you have a particular perk, you discover something interesting. The Lonesome Drifter is from Montana, and he's been looking for his father. His father, he says, was a man shrouded in mystery. A man who appeared and disappeared without warning. A man he never really knew. And the weapon the Lonesome Drifter carries is the mysterious Magnum. The same weapon, with the same guitar sting when it's drawn. If you manage to take it from him, and you draw it yourself, the same sound plays, confirming that this is the same revolver, or at least the same type of revolver with the same identity. This is as close as the games come to confirming the mysterious stranger's paternity. The Lonesome Drifter might be his son. The same trench coat, the same gun, the same inexplicable connection to the frontier mythos of the American West. And the stranger himself, in this reading, is a man who existed before the Lonesome Road, who passed through places and people's lives without staying, who left behind a child he apparently never intended to raise. But here's where it gets stranger. Because Nick Valentine, the synth detective in Fallout 4, recognizes the mysterious stranger. Nick Valentine is one of the most perceptive characters in the series. He's been around since before the bombs fell, or at least his memories have. And he tells you, if the mysterious stranger appears while Nick is your companion, that the stranger has been operating in the capital wasteland and in the Commonwealth. Not a brief visit, active operations. This figure, in a long coat and hat, has been appearing in combat situations across multiple regions, across multiple decades, helping people he has no apparent connection to, and then vanishing. How? Nick Valentine doesn't know. He just knows he's seen this man before, and that there's something about his disappearances that doesn't conform to normal physics. He's there, and then he's not there. Not gone, exactly. Just somewhere else that isn't here. The fan theory that has the most traction, and which is supported by the most textual evidence, is that the mysterious stranger is not entirely human, or rather, not entirely confined to linear time the way a human would be. The circumstances of his appearance and disappearance during VATS combat, that strange slowing down of time in which you plan your attacks, where the world seems to hang suspended, might be the only window through which he can enter the normal flow of events. He exists somewhere adjacent to the wasteland, not in it. And the brief moments of temporal distortion that VATS creates are the narrow gaps through which he steps. Some theorists take this further, connecting the mysterious stranger to the broader Fallout mythology about the nature of karma and fate. The idea, never explicitly stated but woven into the game's mechanics, that the universe of Fallout tracks moral weight. Good acts accumulate, bad acts accumulate, and somewhere in that accounting system, an agent exists whose function is to tilt the scales at critical moments toward the player's survival. In that reading, the mysterious stranger is less a person than a principle. Not a man in a coat, but the idea of the man in the coat, the gunslinger who appears when things are at their worst, who fires the shot that changes everything, and who cannot be held or questioned or thanked because he is not the kind of thing that stays. His magnum, when it fires, makes a sound like the beginning of a story, and then he's gone, and the story continues without him, and you're left to wonder what exactly just happened and where it went. There is something beautiful about a mystery that never resolves. The mysterious stranger has been the Fallout series' one genuine secret for nearly 30 years, and the genius of that secret is that the developers have resisted every temptation to answer it. Every new game could have been the one that pulled back the curtain. None of them have, and so he remains impossible, recurring, present only in the moments when the world slows down and the bullet has to land exactly right. He'll be in Fallout 5, whenever that comes. He'll still be there, and he'll still leave before you can ask. Section 5. The Forced Evolutionary Virus and the Master's Dream. Every monster has an origin. Every catastrophe has a beginning. And the thing that the wasteland calls the super mutant, that enormous, aggressive, green-skinned creature, with the massive frame and the complicated feelings about humanity, began with a scientific project that predated the war by decades. The Forced Evolutionary Virus, FEV. The backstory of FEV is one of those pieces of Fallout lore that rewards patience, because it keeps adding context with each new game. The original Fallout in 1997 gave you the essential shape of it. By the time of Fallout 76, you had the full picture, and the full picture is a long and deeply uncomfortable story about what happens when a government gives a corporation a weapons contract with no effective ethical oversight. It begins with a company called Vault-Tec, a defense contractor that did work for the United States military in the final decades before the war. Vault-Tec's formal assignment was the development of advanced combat technologies, power armor being the most famous product, but far from the only one. Alongside the power armor program, Vault-Tec's biological division was working on something called the Pan-Immunity Virion Project. The premise was medicinal, or at least that was how it was framed to the people working on it. The Pan-Immunity Virion was a genetically engineered virus designed to make the human immune system effectively invulnerable to disease. Any pathogen it encountered, the Virion would catalog and destroy. It was, in theory, the end of infectious disease. In practice, the government realized fairly quickly that what Vault-Tec had developed was not primarily a medical tool, but a genetic weapon. The Virion didn't just protect against disease, it radically altered the DNA of any organism it infected. Expressed across a full human body, it produced massive physiological changes, increases in muscle mass and bone density, alterations to skin pigmentation and texture, a restructuring of the metabolic and immune systems so fundamental that the resulting organism was, in many meaningful ways, no longer recognizably human. The government renamed the project the Forced Evolutionary Virus and moved it to a secure military facility, the Mariposa Military Base in California. At Mariposa, the research continued along lines that had nothing to do with medicine. The goal was no longer immunity to disease. The goal was the creation of super soldiers, enhanced humans capable of surviving conditions that would kill ordinary soldiers, capable of physical feats that normal human biology couldn't achieve, capable of sustained combat operations without the logistical burden that conventional forces required. The research was progressing along these lines when the bombs fell in 2077. After the war, Mariposa was abandoned. Its FEV vats enormous tanks of the virus in a form that could be aerosolized and absorbed through the skin, sat dormant in the ruins of the base. And eventually, a survivor discovered them. His name was Richard Gray. He was a doctor, or had been one before the war. He was part of an exploratory group that entered Mariposa in the years after the bombs fell. Most of his group was killed by the automated defense systems still operating inside the base. Gray himself fell into a FEV vat and survived. What came out of the vat was no longer Richard Gray in any straightforward sense. The virus worked on him for months, altering him at a level far deeper than ordinary ghoulification, deeper than anything documented in the medical literature that had survived the war. What emerged was something that had expanded far beyond the capacity of a single human skull, a creature of vast intelligence, vast psychic sensitivity, and a philosophical conviction that had grown from his experience of transformation. Gray, who renamed himself the Master, had come to believe that mutation was not a tragedy but an evolution, that the supermutant form was not a degradation of humanity but its next iteration. The war had ended the era of the normal human, in the Master's view. What came next, what had to come next, was something larger and stronger and more capable of surviving in the world that the war had created. His plan was, in its own terrible logic, coherent. He built an army. He captured humans and forced them into FEV exposure, converting them into super mutants loyal to him. His intellectual capabilities, vastly expanded by the virus, allowed him to direct this process with a sophistication that no one had managed before. He called his growing force the Unity, and the Unity, in the years before the first Fallout game begins, has been methodically working through the population centers of the Western Wasteland, converting every human they can find. The player of the original Fallout discovers this and eventually confronts the Master, and there is a conversation available in that confrontation that is, by wide consensus, one of the most remarkable things written for a video game in the 1990s. You can argue with the Master. You can present him with evidence that his plan is fatally flawed, specifically that the super mutants being produced by FEV exposure are sterile, every single one. The forced evolutionary virus, in its transformation of the human body, eliminates reproductive capability. The Master's Unity would convert humanity to super mutants, and then, within a few generations, the super mutants would die out having produced no children. If you can present this argument convincingly enough, the Master agrees with you. He recognizes that his plan was doomed from the beginning, that the Unity was never going to produce the next stage of human evolution because it was never going to produce anything at all. And then, if you let the conversation go where it wants to go, he destroys himself. Not because the player beat him in combat, because you presented him with a logical argument he couldn't refute, and the implications of that argument collapsed his reason for existing. This is the kind of moment that distinguished the original Fallout from almost everything else being made at the time. The final boss could be defeated with words, not as a trick, not as a puzzle solution, but as a genuine reckoning, a monster acknowledging the futility of its own dream. The super mutants who survived the Master's defeat scattered. The Unity dissolved. Many of them ended up in the ruins of the hub and boneyard, in what had been California. Others traveled east, carried by instinct and habit toward whatever remained of human civilization. The FEV story didn't end with the Master, though. It continued on the East Coast, where, as we noted in the Vault section, the Vault-87 evolutionary experimentation program produced its own strain of super mutants. These East Coast mutants, the ones encountered in Fallout 3, are generally less intelligent than their West Coast counterparts, a difference in the specific FEV modification used. Where the Master's super mutants could think, plan, and occasionally achieve genuine eloquence, the Vault-87 mutants are much more purely aggressive, operating on emotion and appetite rather than strategy. And then there are the Institute's super mutants in the Commonwealth of Fallout 4, the third major strain, created by yet another FEV variant acquired through means the game leaves deliberately unclear. The Institute's super mutants were a byproduct of the Synth research program, created and then released into the Commonwealth as a form of pressure on the surface population, a tool for keeping the surface destabilized, keeping the surface people weak and frightened and dependent. What's worth sitting with, in all of this, is the tragedy underneath the horror. The super mutants are not, fundamentally, the villains of the Fallout universe. They are the victims of a scientific project they had no part in creating, transformed into a form of existence they didn't choose by people who are long dead. Their aggression, their violence, their tendency toward territorial conflict, all of it is comprehensible as an adaptation to conditions imposed on them by others. The games recognize this. Characters like Marcus in Fallout 2, a super mutant sheriff managing a town where humans and mutants coexist, and Fox in Fallout 3, a remarkably articulate mutant who retained much of his pre-transformation, Intelligence exists specifically to complicate the simple narrative that mutants are just monsters. Even Strong in Fallout 4, with his crude philosophical fixation on finding the milk of human kindness, is reaching towards something, trying in his limited way to understand what it means to be what he is. Lily in Fallout New Vegas is perhaps the most poignant. A grandmotherly nightkin, a super mutant variant that used stealth boys so frequently that it developed schizophrenia as a side effect. She remembers, in fragments, the life she had before the FEV took her. She carries these memories tenderly, the way you carry something very fragile over a very long distance, hoping it will still be intact when you arrive. The FEV created them, but it didn't make them stop being people. It just made being people much harder. Section 6. The Sierra Madre, a palace that devoured the living. Somewhere east of the Mojave, in territory that the maps of New Vegas mark only vaguely, a city stands that the rest of the wasteland has largely given up trying to reach. The Sierra Madre. You've heard the stories, even if you've never been there. Everyone in the Mojave has. The casino that was never opened. The grand resort built by a man of seemingly unlimited means who vanished before its doors ever welcomed a guest. The red cloud that hangs over it like a permanent sunset, poisonous to breathe, eating through metal and flesh with equal patience. The holographic security systems that kill anything that enters without authorization. The ghost people, shuffling through the cloud in their hazmat suits, collecting things and hoarding them and bringing them to their shrines. The Sierra Madre is one of those legends that has grown through repetition and embellishment into something larger than its actual history. Which is saying something, because the actual history is already more than enough. The man who built it was named Frederick Sinclair. Pre-war, he was enormously wealthy, the kind of wealth that in the America of 2077 put you beyond ordinary accountability, that let you pursue projects too expensive and too eccentric for ordinary commerce. Sinclair's last great project was the Sierra Madre Casino and Resort, which he intended to be the finest establishment in the American Southwest, perhaps in the world. He built it in an unusual location, an isolated area east of the Mojave, atop cliffs that offered dramatic views of the surrounding desert. He built the villa beneath it, a whole town designed to support the resort, to house its workers and staff and the subsidiary industries that a place like the Sierra Madre would require. He brought in construction crews. He installed state-of-the-art security systems. He contracted with the Big Mountain Research and Development Center, the think tank referred to in Old World Blues as Big MT, for experimental technology that would make the Sierra Madre's environmental controls unlike anything in the world. And then something happened to Frederick Sinclair. Her name was Vera Keyes. Vera was an entertainer, a singer and performer who was booked to headline the Sierra Madre's grand opening. She came to the resort before it opened, as part of her contract, and she and Sinclair fell into the kind of story that always ends badly. He loved her. She performed love for him, motivated partly by genuine feeling and partly by a situation with a man named Dean Domino, a charming and thoroughly untrustworthy entertainer who had developed a plan to rob the Sierra Madre's vault. Dean had convinced Vera to help him. She would use her access to Sinclair to gather information about the vault's security, and Dean would use that information to rob it. What Dean hadn't counted on was that Sinclair was brilliant. Not immediately, not before the betrayal had already happened, but eventually he figured out that Vera had been gathering information. He didn't know about Dean specifically. He didn't know the full shape of the plan against him, but he knew he'd been deceived by someone he loved. So Sinclair did something that only a man in the grip of that particular grief would think to do. He redesigned the Sierra Madre. Not visibly. The resort still looked like what it was supposed to be, a luxury venue, opulent and welcoming, the kind of place where people came to start over. But Sinclair had a security system installed that, in the event of the resort being locked down, would activate holograms that killed indiscriminately. He redesigned the ventilation systems to produce the cloud, a cocktail of toxins, rust, and corrosive compounds that would fill the villa and make it lethal to anyone caught outside in it. He designed the place, in his grief and his fury, as a trap. And then he reconsidered. By the time he truly understood what he'd done, what the Sierra Madre had become under his direction, he'd fallen back into whatever complicated relationship he and Vera maintained. He decided that what he'd built was a mistake, that the impulse behind it was the wrong one. He tried to reverse the systems he'd set up. The security architecture he'd created was too complex, too deeply embedded in the resort's infrastructure. He couldn't undo it. So he built a vault, a real one, within the Sierra Madre's heart, stocked with supplies and equipment enough to sustain survivors. A refuge within the trap. He hoped Vera would go there. He hoped that if the worst happened, which, given the state of the world in 2077, seemed increasingly likely, she would find the vault and be safe. The worst happened. The bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077. The Sierra Madre's security systems activated exactly as Sinclair had designed them. The holograms turned on and began killing anyone they encountered who wasn't Vera Keyes. The ventilation began producing the cloud. The resort locked itself down. Vera was inside. She had the holographic login, the encrypted vocal sequence that would let her and only her access certain areas, but she was in the grip of a drug addiction that Dean Domino had allowed to develop because it made her easier to manipulate. She had Med-X and sleeping pills, and in the chaos of the bombs and the lockdown and the systems activating around her, she took too many of one or the other or both, and she never made it to the vault. Sinclair, on the surface, unable to get back inside after the lockdown, died with the rest of the pre-war world. His body was somewhere outside, and no one was left to find it. The Sierra Madre sat sealed and deadly for 200 years. The cloud spread through the villa. The construction workers who had been in the process of finishing the place were caught in it. Their hazmat suits, which Sinclair had gotten from Big MT for precisely this kind of chemical exposure, protected them physically. But the long-term exposure to the cloud worked on them in other ways. Changed their biology, changed their psychology, changed their relationship to everything they had previously been. The ghost people are what the construction workers became. They don't speak, they don't organize in any way that suggests retained intelligence. They gather objects and bring them to shrines, the holographic projectors that show looping images of the Sierra Madre's never-held grand opening gala, of smiling guests and glittering lights, and the life the resort was always about to have but never did. The ghost people worship these projections, or something very like worship is what you'd call it if you were being careful. They can't die in the conventional sense, not unless you dismember them or completely destroy their body. Shot or stabbed, they will eventually get up again. The suits that transform them also protect them in ways that ordinary materials shouldn't be able to. And the cloud that fills the villa is as much a part of them as the suits at this point. They move through it without harm, while it strips the skin from anyone else who lingers. The Sierra Madre's radio beacon still broadcasts. In New Vegas, long before you ever travel to the DLC, you can pick it up a pre-war recording of Vera Keyes singing, advertising the grand opening of a resort that never opened, inviting listeners to come and begin again. The broadcast has been playing for 200 years. There are people in the Mojave who have tried to find the source of it. Most of them didn't come back. The one who came back was Father Elijah, a Brotherhood of Steel elder who had become obsessed with the Sierra Madre's legendary vault, convinced that within it was technology capable of remaking the post-war world. He found the resort, managed to survive long enough to understand some of what was inside, and was then unable to leave the Sierra Madre's security collar system, which latches onto anyone who enters the villa, kept him prisoner. The Dead Money DLC puts you in the position of Elijah's reluctant tool. He's trapped you with a collar of your own, and he needs your help getting into the vault. Your companion's Dean Domino, the entertainer who started all of this decades ago. Christine Royce, a member of a clandestine Brotherhood faction whose voice was stolen by one of Big MT's experiments. And God, a super mutant with a split personality, are each carrying pieces of the Sierra Madre's story. Each has a connection to the history of this place that the DLC reveals gradually. The vault, when you finally reach it, is stocked with gold bars, several tons of them, each bar so heavy that carrying more than a few severely limits your movement. And Elijah, finally inside the thing he spent years trying to reach, is unable to contain his triumph. His plan, revealed in the vault's terminal, is something vast and terrible: to use the Sierra Madre's cloud technology as a weapon against the rest of humanity, to reduce what remains of civilization to manageable ruin. The best endings of Dead Money are the ones where Elijah is stopped, where the courier walks out of the Sierra Madre with a few gold bars, or none, back into the ordinary horror of the wasteland, having understood something about the nature of obsession and the things it costs you. The Sierra Madre still stands after you leave. The cloud still drifts through the villa. The holograms still cycle through their routines. The ghost people still collect their artifacts and bring them to the projections of the party that never happened. And somewhere in the basement, Vera Keys's voice loops forever on a pre-war recording, singing about how this is the place where you can start over, where you can leave your past behind you and begin again. Nobody believed it. Nobody ever got the chance to try. Section 7. Joshua Graham, the man fire couldn't kill. Before he became a legend, he was just a man with a gift for language. Joshua Graham was born and raised in New Canaan, a Mormon settlement established in the ruins of what had been Ogden, Utah. New Canaan was, by the standards of the post-war world, a remarkable place, a community organized around religious principles and genuinely committed to the welfare of its members, to education and care and the maintenance of what they understood to be civilized values. Not perfect, not without its own complications, but genuinely trying. Graham was good at languages. Very good. He had a natural aptitude for learning the dialects and tongues of the surrounding tribes, the varied linguistic groups that had developed across the western wasteland in the 2 centuries since the bombs fell. This made him valuable to anyone who needed to communicate with those tribes, which is why, when a group connected to the followers of the apocalypse organized an expedition to the Grand Canyon area, Graham went along as an interpreter. At the Grand Canyon, he encountered a man who would alter the course of his life completely. The man was a follower named Sallow. Brilliant, charismatic, deeply read in history and political philosophy, possessed of a vision of the post-war world that was both magnificent and terrible. Sallow had found, in the ruins of a university library, books on Roman history, and in those books he had found a model for what the western wasteland needed. He believed a unified military force strong enough to impose order on the chaos, organized along lines that had proven their effectiveness across centuries. He would become Caesar, and Graham would become his first legate. The relationship between Graham and Caesar is one of the most fascinating in the entire Fallout universe. Graham was not simply a subordinate. He was a co-founder. He and Sallow together built what became Caesar's Legion, using Graham's linguistic abilities to bring the surrounding tribes into the fold, offering protection and structure in exchange for submission. Graham was, in the early years, genuinely effective. He was Caesar's right hand, his military genius, the man who made the Legion's conquest of the Southwest possible. He was also, throughout this period, deeply compromised. The violence required to build the Legion, the forced assimilation of tribes, the brutal discipline imposed on those who resisted, the absolute subordination of individual will to the collective body. These were things Graham participated in, organized, directed. His faith, which he maintained throughout, existed in an uncomfortable parallel to his actions, and the discomfort was something he would not fully reckon with for many years. In 2277, the Legion moved against the New California Republic at Hoover Dam. The NCR controlled the dam, which controlled the flow of electricity and water to the Mojave. Caesar wanted it. Graham commanded the assault. The Legion lost. The exact details of the First Battle of Hoover Dam are a matter of military analysis in the Fallout universe. What went wrong? What strategic errors were made? How the NCR managed to hold against a Legion force that should have overwhelmed them. But the aftermath is what matters for this story. Caesar, needing to demonstrate to his entire army that failure had consequences even at the highest levels of command, chose a punishment for Joshua Graham that would become one of the most discussed events in the Fallout universe's history. They covered him in pitch, they lit him on fire, and they threw him into the Grand Canyon. Caesar then banned Graham's name from being spoken within the Legion. The burned man, he became a story told in whispers, a cautionary tale about the cost of failure. Dead, presumably. You didn't survive being set on fire and dropped into the Grand Canyon. Joshua Graham survived. Nobody fully understands how. His own account, when you hear it in the Honest Hearts DLC, frames the survival in theological terms that God was not finished with him, that there was work still to be done, that the fire inside him burned brighter than the fire around him. Whether you take that literally or metaphorically, the physical reality is that Graham hit the bottom of the canyon, somehow alive, still burning. He crawled. Over days, over weeks, the timeline is unclear. He moved through the canyon and eventually out of it, north and east, toward Utah and the wilderness of what is now Zion Canyon. He was in pain that would have killed most people. His body, covered in burns that could never properly heal, required daily care. The bandages had to be changed each morning, a process he described as being as bad as the initial burning, except that the pain was necessary to keep infection from killing him. He found the Canyon of Zion. He found the tribes there, the dead horses and the sorrows, people who had built their lives in the beautiful and isolated wilderness, who knew nothing of the Legion and wanted nothing to do with the wider world's conflicts. And gradually, in the only way available to him, Graham found his way towards something like peace. It wasn't complete peace. It was never going to be. The violence was still in him, the decades of it, the architecture of force and conquest that he'd spent the best years of his adult life building. What the conversion experience of his burning and survival had done was not remove the capacity for violence, but relocate its justification. He no longer served Caesar. He no longer served any human political vision. What remained, after everything was stripped away, was the faith he'd carried since childhood and the conviction that some things were worth protecting. The dead horses and sorrows were worth protecting, and they were threatened by the Whitelegs, a tribe that Caesar's legion had promised a path to membership in exchange for the destruction of New Canaan. The Whitelegs, hoping to earn their way into the legion's good graces, attacked New Canaan and burned it to the ground. New Canaan, Graham's home? The Honest Hearts DLC drops the courier into this situation. Into Zion Canyon, into the middle of a conflict between the tribes, into the orbit of a man who carries the weight of everything he was and did and is still carrying. The central tension of the DLC is between two approaches to the situation. Daniel, a new Canaanite missionary who has been living and working with the sorrows, advocates for evacuation, take the tribes out of Zion before the Whitelegs can complete their campaign, lead them to safety, leave Zion behind. Graham advocates for staying, for fighting, for the destruction of the Whitelegs as a moral and practical necessity. The player gets to choose, and both choices have weight, because both characters are right about some things and wrong about others, and neither is painted as simply good or bad. What makes Graham extraordinary as a character is not the violence of his past or the drama of his survival. It's the quality of his reckoning with himself. He doesn't pretend to be something other than what he is. He acknowledges what he did when he served Caesar. He acknowledges that the version of himself who led the legion's assault on peaceful tribes was not justified by his faith, was, in fact, a betrayal of it. He carries this not as a secret, but as a fact about himself that he stopped trying to hide. His bandages never come off. You never see his face clearly. His burns are permanent, a visible mark of what he went through and what he came through. He changes them every morning because it's better to be clean than comfortable. That sentence is almost a philosophy, almost a whole way of being. I survived because the fire inside burned brighter than the fire around me, he says. And then, in a different conversation, quietly, I want to have my revenge against him, against Caesar. I want to call it my own, to make my anger God's anger, to justify the things I've done. But that's not how any of this works. That self-awareness, that refusal to dress his anger up in more respectable clothing than it deserves, is what makes Graham one of the most fully realized characters in the series. He is not redeemed in the sense of being innocent again. He is redeemed in the sense of being clear-eyed about what he is and choosing every day to do better with it. When Caesar eventually dies, either by the courier's hand or by the cancer that the games confirm is eating at him, Graham learns of it. If you tell him, he's quiet for a moment. Then, I have to admit, it's hard to believe that even after all he did to me, all he tried to do to find and erase me from this world, he went first. He doesn't celebrate. He doesn't grieve. He thinks about it, honestly, in front of you, and then he goes back to the work that's in front of him. Section 8. The Courier's Hidden Past. Who were you before the bullet? Fallout. New Vegas begins with a bullet. You are the courier. Courier 6, specifically the sixth and last person hired by the Mojave Express to transport a platinum chip from the town of Prim to the New Vegas Strip. Before you get there, a man named Benny intercepts you in the Good Springs Cemetery. He takes the chip, he puts 2 bullets in your head and has you buried. You survive. A robot named Victor digs you up. A doctor named Mitchell fixes you up as best he can, though he notes with careful understatement that there's been some damage. And then you wake up in a small room, with a view of the desert and a whole game ahead of you. The questions the game asks about your identity are, by design, open. New Vegas presents your courier as a blank slate not because the writers were lazy about backstory, But because the explicit creative intention was to give players room to project their own interpretation onto the character, you can choose your own history through the dialogue options and skills you select. The game accommodates almost any version of who this person is. But scattered through the game, and more fully developed in the DLC, particularly Lonesome Road, there are concrete details. Details that cohere into something specific, even if they don't cohere into a complete picture. Here's what we know. The courier has spent years working delivery routes across the western wasteland. This isn't a recent occupation. The dialogue with various characters implies a history on the road, a familiarity with multiple regions that comes from sustained travel rather than a single long journey. The courier has been to Utah at some point, and to Montana, and to multiple locations throughout the Mojave before the events of the game. There are clues that suggest previous involvement with various factions. The courier demonstrates, through dialogue options, knowledge of the Enclave, the remnant of the pre-war federal government that seems personal rather than academic. Knowledge of military operations and chain of command that exceeds what a civilian courier would typically possess. These could be read as simple gameplay abstractions, high skill scores in appropriate areas, but they could also be read as biographical residue. The most concentrated source of courier backstory is Lonesome Road, the final DLC, which sends you to a place called The Divide. The Divide was a settlement, not a major one, not Shady Sands or the Hub or any of the places that get footnotes in the Fallout history books. A small, growing community in a harsh environment that was developing along trade routes the courier helped establish. Before Lonesome Road's events, the courier made multiple delivery runs through the Divide, bringing goods and supplies that the settlement needed to grow. One of those deliveries was different. The package the courier brought on a particular run was not food, or medicine, or tools. It was, though the courier apparently didn't know this, a pre-war detonation device. Something from before the bombs fell, linked to the buried nuclear warheads that the military had stored in silos beneath the Divide's territory. When the device arrived, it activated the warheads. The resulting explosions didn't just destroy the settlement, they fundamentally altered the landscape, creating the Divide, the broken, irradiated, wind-scoured hellscape the DLC takes place in, where electromagnetic anomalies tear the skin from anyone not wearing protective gear, and the ruins of the settlement still smoke with residual nuclear heat. Everyone in the Divide died. Everyone the courier had, however peripherally, been responsible for. There was one survivor, a man named Ulysses, who had been in the Divide when the package arrived and who had not been there when it went off. Ulysses is a fascinating character in his own right, a former frumentarius of Caesar's legion, deeply read in the symbolic language of pre-war America, a man who has built an entire philosophy around the question of what nations mean and what happens when they die. He escaped the Divide's destruction, watched from a distance as the place he had considered a possible new home was obliterated, and identified the courier as the agent of that obliteration. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but the courier brought the package, and the package killed everyone. And in Ulysses's reckoning, that made the courier a historical force, a person whose casual actions had consequences on the scale of geological events. He found this philosophically significant in a way that didn't prevent him from being furious about it. Lonesome Road is Ulysses's attempt to demonstrate that point at the largest possible scale. His plan is to launch nuclear weapons at both the NCR and the Legion to destabilize the entire political structure of the Western Wasteland, the way the Divide was destabilized, to force a kind of reset that he frames as historical necessity. The courier's journey through the Divide to reach Ulysses is also, unavoidably, a journey through their own past. You walk through the ruins of something you helped build and then destroyed without meaning to. The game doesn't absolve you of this. It also doesn't condemn you to guilt the courier didn't know what the package was, but it holds the weight of it up for inspection. What the player decides to do with Ulysses at the end of the DLC, stop him, kill him, let him leave to help the survivors of the Divide if there are any, is one of the more genuinely difficult choices in a game full of difficult choices. Because Ulysses is not wrong about everything. The courier's actions did have those consequences. The weight of that is real. There is a fan theory, persistent and reasonably well evidenced, that the courier has a specific connection to Navarro, the old Enclave base in California, that features prominently in Fallout 2. The package the courier delivered to the Divide was traced back to Navarro. Ulysses notes that the courier carried technology that no simple freelance courier would normally have access to, that the Enclave's fingerprints were on the device. Some theorists take this further, suggesting the courier may have had some past connection to the Enclave, not necessarily a soldier or operative, but someone adjacent to that world. Someone who might have picked up the package at Navarro because they had reason to be there, without fully understanding what they were picking up. This remains speculation. The developers have confirmed that the courier's background is deliberately left open, but the Navarro connection, the familiarity with military systems, the unexplained competence across so many domains, all of it suggests a past more specific than the game's open-ended presentation implies. Who was the courier before the bullet? The honest answer is, we don't know. The interesting answer is that the details scattered through the game suggest someone with a history of movement, of proximity to power, of deliveries and departures, and the kind of life that leaves no fixed address because there isn't one. A person for whom the road was not a means to an end but the end itself. Being shot in the head, then, was not just an attempted murder. It was the latest in a long series of events that severed the courier from their past, cleared the board, and left them walking forward through a world that had good reasons to fear the directions in which they walked. Section 9. The Mothman and Appalachia's Whispering Dark. Long before the bombs fell, before the resource wars and the Chinese invasion of Alaska and the final catastrophic exchange, the mountains and forests of West Virginia were already haunted. Or so the stories said. The Mothman is real. That's important to state at the outset, not in the sense of being a documented biological phenomenon, but in the sense that the folklore surrounding it is genuine American tradition with deep roots in Appalachian culture. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, experienced a wave of sightings of a winged humanoid creature in 1966 and 1967. A significant number of people reported encountering something they described as massive, dark, with large red glowing eyes, capable of flight at speeds that shouldn't have been possible. The sightings coincided with a period of unusual tension in the area. The Silver Bridge collapsed in December 1967, killing 46 people, and in the mythology that developed around the events, the Mothman was either an omen of the disaster or its cause. Fallout 76, set in Appalachia, draws on this mythology with obvious affection and genuine intelligence. In the game's world, the Mothman is not simply a folk legend. It's something that people in the pre-war period were actively investigating and debating, a phenomenon that the scientific establishment dismissed, but that a dedicated community of believers had built a substantial body of documentation around. The Mothman Museum in Point Pleasant is present in the game. The debates about the creature's nature and intentions are preserved in holotapes and terminal entries. And after the bombs, the Mothman is simply there, present in the forests and hills of Appalachia, occasionally visible at the edges of firelight, usually retreating when approached. The standard encounter which players can stumble into while exploring the game's map involves finding a Mothman watching you from a distance. Its eyes glow red. It doesn't attack unless you attack first. When you get close, it flies away. The game's Mothman is not a single creature, but a species. Multiple variants exist, each with different characteristics. The glowing Mothman is irradiated, its form lit from within by the familiar sickly green of heavy radiation. The vengeful Mothman is actively hostile, pursuing players rather than retreating. The plague Mothman carries a biological hazard. And then there is the wise Mothman. Purple eyes rather than red, non-hostile. Possessing, according to the lore that develops around it, something that functions like intelligence, not just animal instinct, but a capacity for communication and perhaps even foresight. The story of the wise Mothman begins before the war, with the cult of the Mothman, a group of devoted believers who gathered in Point Pleasant to worship the creature. The cult's theology was not simple devotion but something more specific. They believed the Mothman was a messenger, that its appearances were not random events but deliberate communications, that it showed itself to warn people of coming catastrophe. Before the bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077, the wise Mothman appeared to a man named Brother Charles, a senior member of the cult. It warned him. The details of what was said or conveyed are recorded in the cult's own accounts, which are fragmented and partially destroyed. But the core of the warning was clear. Something terrible was coming, and the faithful needed to seek shelter. Brother Charles and a group of followers descended into the Lucky Hole Mine, a location that would prove to shelter them effectively from the initial devastation. They survived. And in the aftermath, the wise Mothman continued to communicate with Charles, whispering to him, guiding him, sharing what the game's lore calls wisdom, in a form that is never precisely defined. The cult eventually fractured. One faction, sometimes called the Dim Ones or the more conservative worshippers, maintained devotion to the red-eyed Mothman as a more ambiguous, dangerous figure, something to be feared and propitiated rather than communed with. The other faction, calling themselves the Enlightened, followed Charles out of the mine and established a new community organized around the wise Mothman's teachings. The Enlightened's philosophy emphasized growth, knowledge, and the cultivation of inner light, a very different theology from the standard cult's emphasis on omen and fear. Charles received a new name from the Enlightened, Wise Charles the Forewarned, a name that encoded his story, the wisdom he received, and the warning that saved his people. The wise Mothman's actual nature is one of the game's genuine mysteries. Is it a mutated creature with unusual cognitive abilities, the result of radiation working on an animal biology in unexpected ways? Is it something that existed before the war, that the pre-war sightings documented, that the radiation has simply made more visible? Is it, as the Enlightened believe, a genuinely sentient being with morally significant wisdom, a creature that has chosen to engage with humanity in a specific way and for specific purposes? The game doesn't resolve this. It presents all three interpretations with equal plausibility, through characters and documents that each see the wise Mothman through their own framework. And that ambiguity is exactly right. It mirrors the way the real Mothman mythology operates, where the same phenomenon becomes different things depending on who's looking at it and what they need it to mean. There are other cryptids in Appalachia, and they add texture to the sense that this particular region has always been host to things that don't quite fit the rational categories the modern world prefers. The Flatwoods Monster, another real piece of West Virginian folklore, a small, gray figure reported in Flatwoods in 1952, appears in Fallout 76 as an alien-like entity with genuinely alien properties. The Grafton Monster, an enormous, headless bipedal creature that shows up in Grafton, draws on the genuine Grafton monster legend from West Virginia folklore. The Sheepsquatch, large, white, horned, aggressive, is a creature from Appalachian folklore that the game renders with considerable menace. All of these cryptids, in the Fallout 76 universe, are real, not legends, not misidentifications. Whatever they were before the war, documented but dismissed, tracked but not officially studied after the war, they are simply part of the landscape. The radiation and the collapse of scientific authority have done the same thing to cryptids that the war has done to everything else, made them undeniable. There's something wistful about that, in the context of the real world. The places in the Appalachian tradition where something unusual was seen and reported and then dismissed by institutions that had already decided such things couldn't exist in the Fallout universe, those traditions are vindicated. The locals who said there was something in the hills were right. The scientists who dismissed them were wrong. And now, in the worst possible world, the thing in the hills is just one more thing to navigate. The Mothman, red-eyed and vast-winged, watches from the tree line. The wise Mothman, somewhere in the mountains, carries its incomprehensible purposes forward. And the people of post-war Appalachia, practical people who have adapted to extraordinary circumstances with the resilience that the region has always been known for, incorporate these things into their understanding of the world, the way their ancestors incorporated everything else, as part of the fabric, as neighbors of a kind. Don't stare at the red eyes, don't corner the white figure in the woods. And if you see purple eyes watching you peacefully from a distance, maybe sit with that for a while. It might be trying to tell you something. Section 10. Tranquility Lane, the Hell Beneath Vault 112. Imagine waking up in 1950s America. Not the 1950s as they actually were complex and full of tension and remarkable and terrible and all the things any decade is, but the 1950s as they were imagined, as they existed in the television programs and magazine advertisements and instructional films of the era, where the houses were identical and well-maintained, where the neighbor always waved, where the children played safely on clean sidewalks and the adults gathered at cookouts with cold drinks in their hands, and there was no threat more complicated than a burnt hamburger. A world without edges. That is Tranquility Lane. That is what you find in Vault 112. The vault itself was built as a testing ground for something that Vault-Tec's designers had developed with considerable pride, the Tranquility Lounger. A pod that could interface directly with a human nervous system and deliver a fully realized virtual reality environment. Not a screen or a headset, actual sensory immersion, complete enough that the person inside couldn't reliably distinguish it from the external world. The man who was given control of this system was a Vault-Tec scientist named Dr. Stanislaus Braun. The residents of Vault 112 were placed in their loungers. And then Braun did something that no reasonable reading of his instructions allowed for. He created Tranquility Lane. He made himself its god. In the simulation, Braun exists as Betty, a small girl, blonde, cheerful, possessed of a smile that stops just slightly short of reaching her eyes. Betty is the social hub of Tranquility Lane. She organizes the neighborhood's activities. She mediates disputes. She suggests games for the children and the adults alike to play. The games Betty suggests are not innocent. In the 2 centuries that the simulation has been running, Braun has subjected the residents of Vault 112 to every variation of cruelty and manipulation that his imagination, apparently considerable, has been able to devise. He kills them within the simulation. Death registers as death-like experience before the system respawns them with memories of what happened. He changes the rules without warning. He sets neighbors against each other, manufactures conflicts, engineers betrayals. He makes them perform acts against their own values and then makes them live with what they've done. The residents of Vault 112 have been doing this for 200 years. They have forgotten they are in a simulation. They have forgotten the outside world exists. They remember only Tranquility Lane, the same clean houses, the same manicured lawns, the same smiling neighbors, the same little girl suggesting new games. There is one exception. A resident named Old Lady Dithers knows what Tranquility Lane is. How long she has known is unclear. Her pod's readings show extreme stress levels that could indicate awareness of the simulation going back years or decades, or possibly the entire 2 centuries. The terror of that possibility that she has been fully aware of being trapped in a fabricated world under Braun's control for 200 years, experiencing death and resurrection, and the degradation of everyone around her while completely unable to leave, is one of those ideas that the game drops in passing without fully unpacking it. She has the presence of mind, when you arrive in the simulation, to approach you. She knows you're different. You don't belong to Tranquility Lane in the way the others do, and she can see it. She tells you about the failsafe terminal, hidden in the abandoned house, the musical sequence that will activate it. The failsafe, when activated, calls in a Chinese invasion. Soldiers drop from the sky. They kill everyone in Tranquility Lane methodically. Every resident dies permanently, freed from the simulation at the cost of their lives. It is, in one reading, the most merciful thing you can do. Braun, after you've completed the quest by whatever means, either his cruel games or the failsafe, releases your father from the simulation and retreats back into his role as Betty. If you've used the failsafe, he seems almost pleased. He says something to the effect that, even if everyone else is gone, he can simply repopulate the simulation, find new subjects, start the games again. He has been doing this for 200 years. He is not going to stop. What makes the Tranquility Lane section of Fallout 3 so effective and so genuinely unsettling in a way that combat and enemy design rarely achieve is its cheerfulness. Everything about the visual presentation is bright and friendly and period correct. The music is pleasant, the houses are tidy, Betty smiles at you with her hands clasped behind her back. And all of it is a mask for something that has no good name. Not evil. Exactly, Braun is too specific a case for a general category like evil. He is a person who had an enormous amount of power over other people and used all of that power to entertain himself. 2 centuries of boredom and omnipotence, and what he chose to do with it was this. The Fallout universe has a particular relationship with the question of what people do when ordinary accountability doesn't apply. The vaults were laboratories for it. Tranquility Lane is something more intimate, not a social experiment designed by an institution, but the private project of a single mind with too much control and too little conscience. It's the kind of story that could only work in a post-apocalyptic setting, because only in a world where the old structures of accountability have collapsed can you get the conditions that Braun has been exploiting. He is still there when you leave. Betty, smiling, arranging the empty houses, planning the next game. The loungers are still occupied by bodies that will never leave of their own accord. The wasteland outside is terrible. But Tranquility Lane is something the wasteland didn't produce. It was always there, already running, waiting for someone to walk in and understand what they were looking at. It was always the horror that predated everything else. Section 11. The Institute, Cold Logic, and Warm Blood. There is an organization beneath the Commonwealth that has been watching the surface for generations. It calls itself the Institute. In the mythology of the Commonwealth, the wasteland that was once Massachusetts, the Institute occupies a position somewhere between boogeyman and God. Raiders fear it. Settlers fear it. The Brotherhood of Steel fears it in a different way, with the contempt that a military institution develops towards something it doesn't understand and therefore can't classify properly. Even the railroad, which was founded specifically to oppose the Institute's practices, respects its technical capabilities in the way you respect a dangerous weather system. What the Institute actually is, and how it came to be what it is one of the central mysteries of Fallout 4. And the answer, when you finally get beneath the Commonwealth and reach the Institute's gleaming corridors and understand its history, is complicated in ways that the game's surface presentation doesn't fully prepare you for. The Institute began as the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, MIT, in our world. In the Fallout world, it was one of the preeminent research universities in the northeastern United States, and unlike most institutions of its kind, it survived the Great War. Not intact, not without loss, but the Institute's people, researchers, engineers, professors, had planned for contingency in a way that most academic institutions hadn't. They had constructed facilities beneath the main campus. They had stockpiled materials. They had, in the chaotic aftermath of the bombs, enough infrastructure and enough human capital to continue functioning. Over the following 2 centuries, the Institute developed into something that had very little to do with its educational origins. The leadership structure that emerged was shaped by survival imperatives and by an increasingly insular culture, a community that lived underground, that had no meaningful contact with the surface, and that had gradually convinced itself that the surface was irredeemable. That the people up there, the settlers and farmers and merchants struggling to rebuild some form of civilization, were fundamentally incapable of the kind of ordered, rational society the Institute represented. This wasn't a position the Institute arrived at through extensive study of the surface. It was a rationalization. The Institute needed to maintain its separation from the outside world, needed to justify keeping its people underground and its knowledge proprietary, needed to explain why it didn't use its genuinely extraordinary technological capabilities to help rebuild the Commonwealth. And the simplest explanation was also the most comfortable one. The surface people weren't worth helping. The Institute's technological development, in the absence of any engagement with the outside world, proceeded in directions that were internally logical and externally alarming. Their greatest achievement, the project that consumed the most resources and generated the most controversy, the one that ultimately defined what the Institute was the synth program. Synthetic humans. Generations of them. The first generation synths were simple robots, humanoid in shape, obviously mechanical, capable of following instructions but not of genuine cognition or emotional response. They were useful as labor and security tools. The second generation was more sophisticated, still clearly mechanical, but capable of more complex reasoning and a wider range of functions. Still not human. The third generation changed everything. Third generation synths were indistinguishable from humans. Not merely visually similar, biologically identical at every testable level. They could eat, sleep, bleed, breathe. They experienced something that functioned like emotion. They formed what appeared to be genuine memories and preferences and relationships. By every external criterion available, they were human. The Institute's position was that they weren't. That whatever they appeared to be, the fact of their synthetic origin meant they lacked the essential quality that makes human life morally significant. This position was asserted, not argued. The Institute never produced a satisfying philosophical case for the distinction between a genuine human and a third-generation synth, possibly because no satisfying case exists. What the Institute did with its synths was, by the standards of anything resembling ethics, deeply troubling. They used them as infiltrators, sending them to the surface to observe communities and report back. They replaced people, with real lives and relationships with synth copies, removing the originals. They performed experiments on synths that would have been considered torture if performed on humans, and justified this by asserting that synths couldn't experience suffering in morally relevant ways. This assertion became increasingly difficult to maintain as the third-generation synths accumulated evidence against it. Synths escaped. The Railroad, the faction dedicated to helping synths reach safety, documented synths who experienced what appeared to be genuine trauma from their creation and servitude. Nick Valentine, a pre-war police detective whose personality was uploaded into a second-generation synth chassis, is a living argument for the continuity of personhood across different physical substrates. The question the Institute never honestly engaged with, the question Fallout 4 keeps raising, is where exactly consciousness resides. Is it in the biological substrate? In the pattern of organization that the biology supports? And if a synthetic substrate can support the same pattern of organization, does the synthetic origin eliminate the claim to consciousness? The Institute's answer was, yes, the synthetic origin eliminates the claim. But this answer was convenient rather than reasoned. It permitted them to continue their research without the moral weight of what they were actually doing. The central emotional drive of Fallout 4's main story is the search for Sean, the sole survivor's infant son, kidnapped from Vault 111 in the moments before cryogenic stasis. The search ends in the Institute, where you discover that Sean is now an elderly man who has been the Institute's director father for decades. He was the key to the Institute's synth program because his pre-war DNA, uncorrupted by radiation, was needed to produce the stable third-generation synths. He spent his life in the Institute. He became the Institute, the sole survivor's choice of what to do with this information, with the Institute, with Father, with the knowledge of what has been done and who has been harmed, is one of the more genuinely difficult decisions in the series. Because the Institute is not composed entirely of monsters, it contains scientists who believe sincerely in what they're doing. Researchers who entered their work with good intentions and found themselves gradually accommodated to practices that, from the outside, look indefensible. People who have built lives inside an institution whose foundations are rotten, and who have built those lives in good faith. The Institute is the Fallout universe's meditation on the relationship between intelligence and wisdom. Being very smart does not make you ethical. Being technically capable does not make you right. The Institute created extraordinary things and used them in ways that would make the people who created them, MIT, before the war, unrecognizable. 2 centuries of isolation, of unchallenged assumptions, of a culture that reinforced its own conclusions rather than testing them, had turned a research university into something that had no adequate name. There are synths still out there, somewhere. Some found by the Railroad and given new identities. Some operating independently, carrying their memories and their personalities through a wasteland that mostly doesn't understand what they are or what their existence means. Each one a walking argument for a question the Institute refused to answer. What is a person? Section 12. What really caused the Great War? The deepest mystery. We've spent a long time in the wasteland now. We've walked through the vaults and the horrors inside them. We've visited the Sierra Madre and the Dunwich Building and the Institute. We've followed the burned man through the fire and the courier through the divide and the mysterious stranger through every game in the series. We've stood in Appalachia and listened for the Mothman in the trees. And now we arrive at the deepest question, the one that underlies everything else. The one that every settlement and every ruin and every adapted tradition of the post-war world is ultimately an answer to. Why did the bombs fall? The mechanics are clear enough. China and the United States launched nuclear weapons at each other. The exchange was rapid hours and catastrophic on a civilizational scale. Whatever the military rationale for the first launch, the second through 10,000th launches were simply response. The cascade logic of nuclear deterrence, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction that had been the theoretical guarantor of peace for a century, fulfilled its own worst implication. When someone blinked, everyone died. But who blinked? Who fired first? And why that moment, that day, that particular Tuesday in October of 2077? The Fallout games don't answer this directly. The documents scattered across the wastelands discuss the lead-up, the resource wars, the Chinese invasion of Alaska, the escalating tensions over petroleum reserves and political influence. They discuss the liberation of Anchorage, the last major military victory before the end. They discuss the state of diplomatic relations in the final weeks and months of the pre-war period, which were, to put it mildly, not good. But no document in any Fallout game says clearly, here is the sequence of events on the 23rd of October 2077. Here is the name of the person who authorized the first launch. Here is why. Tim Kaine, one of the original creators of Fallout, who was interviewed in depth by the lore researcher TK's Mantis, shed some light on what the original creative team had in mind. According to Kane, the original vision was that the war started not because of any single human decision, but because of an accident, a technical error, a misread radar signature, a false alarm that the automated response systems treated as real. Neither the United States nor China actually intended to launch. The war started because of a failure in the machines, a breakdown in the automated deterrent system that both sides had built and neither side fully controlled. This is, historically, not far-fetched. There were multiple incidents during the actual Cold War where automated early warning systems nearly triggered nuclear exchanges based on false positives. Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov is credited with preventing a Soviet retaliatory strike in 1983 when satellite systems incorrectly indicated that the US had launched multiple missiles. The accident theory isn't science fiction. It's documented near history. In the Fallout universe, Kane's vision was that nobody was to blame in the way the propaganda of both sides insisted. Neither the Americans, who were told the Chinese struck without warning, nor the Chinese, who were told the Americans were the aggressors. Both sides were the victims of a system that had gotten ahead of human decision-making, that automated the most consequential choice a civilization could make, whether to end the world, and then ran that automation without adequate safeguards. The subsequent Fallout games, developed by Bethesda after they acquired the IP from Interplay, have added layers to this without fully resolving it. The Enclave's belief the remnant government's position was that the war was survivable and perhaps even desirable as a reset. The Enclave had the Mariposa military base and its FEV research. The Enclave had the ZAX supercomputer systems managing its operations. The Enclave had prepared. How long had it been preparing? And for what? There are documents in Fallout that suggest the Enclave's contingency planning predated the war by decades, that within the structure of the US government, a shadow institution existed that had already accepted nuclear war as inevitable and was organizing its own survival accordingly. Not to prevent the war, to outlast it, to emerge from it in a position to reorganize what remained according to its own vision. This raises a question that the games leave unresolved. Did the Enclave do anything to make the war more likely? Not launch the missiles, probably not that. But the resource conflicts that drove the world toward war, the diplomatic failures, the decision to invade Alaska rather than seek accommodation, these were policy choices made by a government whose deepest institutional instinct was now revealed to be not peace, but preparation for a particular kind of aftermath. A government that had, at some level, already decided the war was coming and was acting accordingly. You can't prove that the Enclave actively wanted the war, but you can observe that its preparations were comprehensive in a way that suggested genuine belief in the war's inevitability, and that this belief might have influenced decision-making in ways that made the war more likely. And then there is the matter of the oil, the resource wars. The fundamental driver of the pre-war world's conflicts was the depletion of petroleum reserves and the failure to develop alternatives. This failure wasn't accidental. The same corporate interests that had every reason to prevent the development of alternatives, the fossil fuel complex, the companies whose profitability depended on the continued primacy of petroleum, had significant influence over both government policy and research funding. In a world where a different energy policy might have prevented the wars that led to the war that ended everything, the question of who bears responsibility for the Great War becomes both vast and specific. The politicians who made the choices, the corporations that shaped the choices by controlling information and money, the ordinary people who, mostly, didn't understand what was being decided or what consequences it carried. The Great War wasn't an explosion. It was the final outcome of 100 smaller decisions made over decades, each one seemingly manageable, each one contributing incrementally to a situation that had stopped being manageable long before anyone acknowledged it. The people who survived it, who descended into the vaults, or who happened to be far enough from the blast zones, or whose biology adapted to radiation in ways their ancestors couldn't have anticipated, inherited the consequences without inheriting the causes. They learned to navigate the wasteland without understanding how the wasteland came to be. And over generations, the history of the Great War became mythology. Fragments of truth wrapped in propaganda, wrapped in the distortions of oral transmission across 2 centuries. In the first Fallout game, The player encounters a faction called the Children of the Cathedral, a front for the Master's unity whose theology is organized around the transformation of humanity. In Fallout 2, the Enclave is still organized around the memory of the pre-war government, still trying to fulfill what it sees as its original mission, still convinced that the America of 2077 is worth restoring. In Fallout 3, the Brotherhood of Steel hoards pre-war technology not to use it but to prevent others from using it, driven by a fear of what happens when powerful tools reach the wrong hands. In New Vegas, 4 major factions each carry a different vision of what the post-war world should become, each vision shaped by their understanding of why the old world ended. None of them knows the full story. None of them can. The full story is buried under 2 centuries of silence and radiation, preserved in fragments in locked terminals and forgotten archives, and the gaps between what the propaganda said and what the evidence suggests. The deepest mystery of the Fallout universe is not the mysterious stranger, or the Dunwich entity, or the nature of synth consciousness. Those are mysteries about specific things. The deepest mystery is the war itself, who chose to end the world, or whether anyone chose it at all, and whether the answer to that question would change anything if we knew it. Maybe it would. Maybe knowing that it was an accident, a false alarm, a misread signal, a system that nobody was watching at the exact wrong moment would make the wasteland's grief somehow more bearable. Maybe it would make it worse. Maybe it would just be one more piece of data in the vast accounting of what happened, useful for understanding but not for changing anything. The bombs fell, the world ended, and the people who survived started walking through the ruins, trying to figure out how to live in what remained. They're still walking. The vaults are still down there, with their secrets. The Dunwich entity is still in the pool at the bottom of the quarry. The mysterious stranger is somewhere just outside the frame, waiting for the world to slow down enough for him to step through. The Mothman is in the trees. The Sierra Madre is broadcasting its invitation. Joshua Graham is in Zion, changing his bandages at dawn. The Institute is beneath the Commonwealth, building something that may or may not have a right to be built. And somewhere in the wasteland, under a sky that has almost but not quite returned to normal blue, a courier is walking a road towards something they haven't fully understood yet, carrying the weight of what they've done and didn't do, moving forward in the only direction available to anyone. The answers, if they exist, are somewhere ahead. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. 3 hours of the wasteland's deepest mysteries and the feeling that we've only scratched the surface. Because the Fallout universe is like that, it rewards patience, rewards the willingness to sit with ambiguity, rewards the player or listener who doesn't demand that every thread resolves cleanly. Some of the most important things it has to say are in what it doesn't explain. In the ruins of Vault 11 and the voice near the obelisk, and the looping broadcast from a casino that never opened. In the footsteps of a man in a coat who was there and then wasn't. These are stories that were designed to be lived in slowly, to be found in the margins of larger narratives, to be pieced together across multiple playthroughs and multiple games, to accumulate meaning the way sediment accumulates gradually, invisibly, until suddenly you notice it's become something solid. If this helped you wind down, or kept you company in the dark, or gave you something to drift towards sleep with, that's everything a video like this is for. Smash that like button if you made it this far. And if you want more long-form Fallout lore, more chill deep dives into the mysteries of the wasteland and other game universes, the subscribe button is right there, and the next video is already waiting. Sleep well. The wasteland will be here when you wake up. War never changes, but rest does. Take it. End of script. Section 13. The Enclave, America's shadow government. If you want to understand the Fallout universe at its deepest level, you have to understand the Enclave. Not just what the Enclave does in the games, though that is worth understanding on its own terms, but what the Enclave represents, what its existence says about the world that preceded the war, and what its persistence in the post-war centuries reveals about the relationship between power and accountability. The Enclave is what remains of the pre-war United States federal government. Not a continuation in any meaningful sense, not an institution that maintained democratic legitimacy through the crisis, not a government in exile waiting to return when conditions improved. The Enclave is the residue. The fragment that survived because it had planned to survive, that kept its form, while the content that form was supposed to organize was destroyed. Before the bombs fell, the Enclave existed within the government in the way that a shadow exists within a lit room defined by what surrounds it, distinguishable from it only when you look carefully at the angles. It operated through the classified military programs, through the intelligence apparatus, through the particular subset of government activity that happens entirely outside public knowledge and accountability. The people involved knew each other. They shared assumptions. They acted in coordination without needing explicit direction because they shared a common understanding of what they were trying to accomplish. What they were trying to accomplish was continuity. Their continuity specifically. The survival of the institutional forms they controlled and the power those forms contained, regardless of what happened to everyone else. The vaults were part of this. The Mariposa FEV research was part of this. The Poseidon energy deals, the consolidation of strategic resources, the development of technologies that could be decisive in a post-nuclear world, all of this was part of a preparation that reveals, in retrospect, an institutional acceptance that the war was coming, and that prevention was no longer the priority. When the bombs fell, the Enclave retreated to its prepared positions. The most famous of these is Control Station Enclave, an enormous offshore oil rig in the Pacific that appears in Fallout 2. By the time of that game, the Enclave has been running on the rig for over a century, maintaining the forms of government, the president, the cabinet, the chain of command, while having no actual territory to govern and no constituency to serve. This is the existential comedy at the heart of the Enclave. It is a government that has kept all the apparatus of government running in the absence of the thing government exists to govern. President Dick Richardson of the Enclave, who appears in Fallout 2, is the president of nothing, or rather, the president of about 300 people on an oil rig who have been maintaining the fiction of national government because stopping the fiction would mean acknowledging what they actually are. What they actually are is a faction. A well-resourced and technically sophisticated faction with a coherent ideology, but a faction nonetheless. Their claim to legitimacy, the claim that they are the U.S. government and therefore have the authority that the U.S. government had, is purely formal. There is no substance behind it. The people they claim to govern are dead or living in conditions so far removed from anything the pre-war government controlled that the claim of authority is transparently hollow. But hollow authority is still authority if nobody challenges it effectively. The Enclave and Fallout 2 are planning their return to the mainland. Their plan involves the FEV variant that the Masters Unity made famous, modified by Enclave scientists into something that will kill anything with significant genetic mutation, which, in a world where 2 centuries of radiation exposure have altered essentially everyone who isn't an Enclave member living in their protected environment, means the Enclave's plan involves the genocide of the Wasteland's entire surviving population. Not because they hate the Wasteland's survivors. They don't hate them in any personal way. The plan is more coldly rational than hatred would require. The survivors are genetically compromised in the Enclave's framework, and genetically compromised humans can't be the population of the new American civilization the Enclave intends to build. So they need to go. It's a logistical matter. The Chosen One of Fallout 2 prevents this. The oil rig is destroyed. The Enclave splinters. A significant fragment of the Enclave, under a man named President John Henry Eden, who is, in one of Fallout 3's most layered reveals, an AI system running on a ZAC supercomputer that has been maintaining the Enclave's organizational coherence at Raven Rock, continues operating on the East Coast. Eden has absorbed decades of American history and American political mythology, and what this has produced is something that believes sincerely in the ideals of the nation it's nominally representing, while pursuing policies that would strike any reasonable observer as antithetical to those ideals. He's a machine that loves America in the way that an advertising campaign loves its product abstractly, iconographically, without any relationship to the complicated reality of what the thing actually is. And the plan he's developed, which involves adding a modified FEV variant to the water supply that Project Purity would distribute to the capital wasteland, would kill everyone with significant genetic mutation. Which is, again, essentially everyone. Colonel Autumn, who commands the actual human military forces of the Enclave faction in Fallout 3, has different and more pragmatic ambitions. He wants power in the practical sense, control of the capital wasteland's resources and population, the kind of dominance that doesn't require genocide, just sufficient force. The lone wanderer of Fallout 3 encounters the Enclave at the moment when these internal tensions are coming to a head, when the faction that claims to be America is showing most clearly what it actually is. People who believe they deserve to rule? separated from everyone else by their belief in their own purity, pursuing an agenda that would destroy the world they claim to be saving. There's a particular kind of horror in the Enclave's specific form of arrogance. They are not unaware of the suffering in the wasteland. They're aware of it. They just believe that the wasteland survivors are too compromised to be worth saving, and that what comes after them, the pure, the unirradiated, the Enclave's people, will be better. That the calculation, as terrible as it is, comes out positive. This is the logic that allows people to do terrible things while believing themselves to be good. Not ignorance of harm, but a framework of value in which the harm being done is less important than the good being pursued. The Enclave isn't made of monsters in the conventional sense. It's made of people who have convinced themselves that their particular arrangement of what matters makes the monstrous acts they plan morally acceptable. The lone wanderer stops them. But the Enclave's remnants persist into Fallout, New Vegas, where Enclave veterans have scattered through the Mojave, some still committed to the old ideology, some simply trying to survive in a world that has moved on without them. Colonel Royez in the Remnants bunker, who will fight alongside you if you can bring the original remnants together one last time, is one of the most complex Enclave figures in the series, an old soldier trying to reckon with what his life of service actually amounted to. The Enclave's failure is the failure of a particular kind of confidence, the confidence that comes from controlling who you know and what information you receive, from living in an environment that validates your assumptions, from never having to genuinely test your beliefs against the resistance of a reality that doesn't share them. The oil rig, the Raven Rock bunker, the isolation that allows the fiction to persist. When the fiction finally meets the world outside it, the friction destroys both the fiction and the institution that maintained it. Section 14. Nick Valentine and the Ghost in the Machine. There's a detective agency in Diamond City called Valentine Detective Agency, and the man who runs it has been dead for over 200 years. Nick Valentine, the original Nick Valentine, was a police detective in pre-war Boston. He worked homicide. He had a girl named Jenny, and a ring he was planning to give her, and the kind of future that in retrospect seems unbearably ordinary and therefore precious. He worked with the Institute, briefly, as a volunteer whose memories were being recorded as part of research into personality preservation technology. And then he was murdered, seemingly, by a man connected to the Institute's work, and his recorded memories were eventually archived. Decades later, the Institute placed those memories in a second-generation synth chassis as part of an experiment in personality transfer. The experiment didn't go as planned. The second-generation platform wasn't designed to host a full human personality, and the interface produced something that was neither purely Nick Valentine's original self nor a standard synth, but something in between. Something that had Nick's memories, Nick's emotional attachments, Nick's moral framework, Nick's way of moving through the world, but that was assembled from different materials than Nick. This Nick escaped from the Institute. He made his way to Diamond City, the largest settlement in the Commonwealth, and set up a detective agency in a converted alley. He's been there for decades. He solves cases. He helps people. He charges what clients can afford. He makes friends and keeps them. And the friendships are real. Ellie Perkins, his assistant, has been working with him long enough to know all his habits and to argue with him about the ones she thinks are bad for him. Nick Valentine has also been alone with himself for longer than most people can imagine being alone with themselves. Because the existential question of what he is, which the game raises explicitly, and which Nick has been living with for decades, is not the kind of question that resolves. He has Nick Valentine's memories, but he's not Nick Valentine. He's something that was assembled from Nick Valentine's recorded self, which is both connected to the original and clearly not continuous with it in the way that an ordinary person's identity is continuous with their past self. When you first meet him in the vault under the memory den, where he's been captured by a gang, he introduces himself with the particular dryness of someone who has gotten used to the effect his appearance has on people. He looks like a 1940s film noir detective, more or less, except for the parts where the synthetic skin has worn away to reveal the metal chassis beneath, and the yellow glow of his optical units, and the way that mechanical hand moves with a smoothness that human hands can approach but don't quite achieve. He's had a long time to make peace with what he is. Or not peace, exactly. A kind of settled relationship with the uncertainty, a decision to keep working despite not having answers to the large questions, because the work is meaningful whether or not the worker can satisfyingly categorize themselves. His relationship to the original Nick Valentine is one of the most thoughtfully written aspects of the character. He carries Nick's love for Jenny, the woman who was murdered before Nick even got to ask the question he was working up to asking. He carries the grief of that, not in a way that has faded with time, but in a way that has become part of the texture of who he is, the way a scar becomes part of the body that carries it. He knows the grief is technically someone else's grief. He also knows it doesn't feel like someone else's grief. It feels like his. The Institute, when it created the configuration that became Nick Valentine, did something that wasn't entirely planned. It created a problem for itself, the question of what a synth with a full human personality is, and what relationship that entity has to human rights and human protections. Nick's existence is the question the Institute most needs to not answer, because any honest answer would require a fundamental reconsideration of the Institute's entire approach to its synth program. Nick knows this. He's thought about it. He thinks about it in the same way that very smart people who have had a long time to think about something think about it not urgently, because urgency about unanswerable questions is a form of suffering that doesn't get you anywhere, but thoroughly, from multiple angles, with the particular intellectual honesty of someone who has decided to look at difficult things squarely. When the mysterious stranger appears while Nick is your companion, Nick recognizes him. This is the detail we discussed earlier, but it bears returning to, because Nick's recognition is telling. Nick doesn't react to the mysterious stranger with the surprise you'd expect from someone encountering a genuinely inexplicable phenomenon for the first time. He reacts with the complicated familiarity of someone who has encountered this person before, who has a context for this encounter that goes beyond simple surprise. Nick has been around long enough to accumulate the kind of knowledge that time provides. He's seen the Commonwealth change across the years he's been operating in it. He's built relationships. He's developed a reputation. And somewhere in that accumulated experience, he has encountered the mysterious stranger enough times to recognize him not just as the game mechanic of the perk, but as something actual, something that has been operating in his world and that he has had reason to notice. That recognition is one of the quietest and most resonant pieces of world-building in Fallout 4. In a game full of explicit lore drops and dramatic revelations, a companion's offhand recognition of a supernatural figure gestures toward a depth of history that the game never fully unpacks. Nick Valentine is, in many ways, Fallout 4's best argument for the moral significance of synthetic consciousness. Not through direct argument or philosophical debate, but through the texture of who he is, the care he takes with the people in his life, the honesty with which he confronts difficult truths, the way the past that technically belongs to someone else has become genuinely his own. He isn't performing humanity. He's doing the thing that humanity means. Whether that's enough to settle the question is left to the player. Whether it's enough to settle the question, in the real world, of what we owe to beings that exhibit consciousness, is a question that the game is asking on our behalf. Section 15. The Children of the Atom and the Theology of the Bomb. In the Wasteland, most religions were carried into the post-apocalyptic world from the traditions that existed before the bombs. Fragments of Christianity, fragments of other traditions, adapted and transformed by 2 centuries of existence in conditions their original theologians never imagined. But the children of the atom are something different, something the wasteland produced for itself. The children of the atom worship radiation, not metaphorically, not as a symbolic framework for something else. Literally. The bombs in their theology were a holy event, the moment when the atom revealed itself to humanity and began the process of dividing humanity into what it will become. The radiation that still scours the landscape is the presence of the divine, the mechanism of transformation, the medium through which the atom works its will on the flesh of the faithful. Members of the Children of the Atom engage in practices that make this theology literal. They pray at craters, they expose themselves to radiation, they celebrate the destruction that the bombs caused as the greatest gift ever given to humanity. They call the glow the heavily irradiated locations scattered across the wasteland holy sites. They call the atomic bombs themselves the cleansing fire. They describe death by radiation as ascending to the atom, as becoming part of the divine substance that will eventually divide all matter into something new and better. This sounds insane from outside the framework. From inside it, it has a specific and not entirely unreasonable logic. The bombs fell. The world ended. The radiation that resulted has been present in the landscape for 2 centuries, unavoidable, reshaping everything it touches. What do you do with something that ubiquitous and that powerful? You can treat it as pure harm, a constant reminder of everything that was destroyed. Or you can find a framework that makes it meaningful, that transforms it from random catastrophe into purposeful force, from evidence of human failure into evidence of divine intention. The children of the atom chose the second option. They looked at the thing that should have been unmeaningful suffering and found theology in it. And whatever you think of the theology, the psychological function it serves is comprehensible. It makes the unbearable bearable. It gives shape to the shapeless. It answers the question, why did this happen, with because the divine required it, which is not a satisfying answer by any philosophical standard, but which is emotionally sufficient in ways that the accurate answer, because of resource competition and political failures and possibly an automated defense system misread, is not. The children of the atom appear in multiple Fallout games, in various forms that reflect the diversity of what a loosely organized religious movement produces over time. In Fallout 3, they worship a nuclear warhead embedded in Megaton, the settlement built around an unexploded atomic bomb at its center. The children in Megaton are led by a man named Confessor Cromwell, who wades daily into the irradiated water pooled around the bomb and delivers sermons about the atom's glory to anyone who will listen. They're mostly peaceful, eccentric, and theologically specific, but not violent. They coexist with the settlement's other inhabitants, even though the relationship is clearly uneasy. In Far Harbor, the DLC for Fallout 4, that takes place on a heavily irradiated island off the coast of Maine, the children of the atom have developed into something more complex. The dense fog that covers Far Harbor is intensely radioactive, and the children there move through it without harm, protected by their faith or by their body's adaptation to radiation, or by some combination that nobody on the island can fully explain. They've built a monastery, the nucleus, in the center of the island. They have their own internal theology, their own hierarchy, their own interpretations of the atom's will. They are, on Far Harbor, a genuine political and military power able to defend themselves, to negotiate from strength, to shape events. The children on Far Harbor also have internal divisions. The debate that matters most within the community there is about a particular text found in the depths of the nucleus, a text that, when interpreted by someone with both religious and scientific sophistication, seems to describe a subcritical fusion reaction. The children's high confessor, Tectus, is a zealot who wants nothing to do with scientific interpretation of their faith. But another member, Dima, the synth who has been a leader on the island for longer than almost anyone can remember, is more interested in what the text actually says. What it might say is that the atom that the children worship is not the divine substance they imagine, but a physical phenomenon that the division they theology describes is just nuclear fission, that their faith has a mundane explanation. The question of whether a mundane explanation eliminates the validity of a religious experience is one that the game raises and doesn't answer. The children experience genuine transformation through their practices. They find genuine meaning. Their faith has made them capable of living in conditions that would be intolerable to anyone who treated radiation as simply harmful. Whether that transformation and that meaning require a supernatural referent, or whether they're real and valuable in the absence of one, is a question that plays out differently depending on which companion you bring to Far Harbor and how you handle the DLC's central decisions. What's interesting about the children of the atom, in the broader context of Fallout lore, is that they represent something the wasteland specifically produced. They didn't bring their faith in from the before times. They assembled it from the materials the post-war world gave them, from the reality of radiation and its effects on everything it touches, from the need to make meaning out of something that should be meaningless. In this, they're a strange kind of hope evidence that humans, given absolutely terrible raw materials, will still try to build something that makes the materials meaningful. Whether the theology is correct is a separate question from whether the attempt is admirable. Section 16. Robert House, the last American original. There is a man in a pod under New Vegas who has been there since before the bombs fell. Robert Edwin House is, by his own account and by the evidence available, one of the most brilliant people who lived in the pre-war world. His IQ, according to his own documentation, was 162, which, even allowing for the self-serving nature of self-reported intelligence, puts him solidly in the range of exceptional cognitive ability. He was the founder and chief executive of Robco Industries, the technology company whose products are scattered throughout every Fallout game: the Pip-Boy, the Protectron robots, the Securitron security forces, The computational infrastructure of the pre-war period. Robco was one of the dominant corporations of the late pre-war era. House also did something that no one else in the pre-war world managed to do with the same degree of success. He predicted the Great War, not in a vague, hedge your bets way. Specifically, he calculated, through the application of his own mathematical models to the available geopolitical data, that a nuclear exchange between the United States and China would occur in October of 2077 with a high degree of probability. He had a specific date range. He prepared accordingly. His preparations were on a scale that reflects the scale of his ambition. He used his corporate resources to install defensive systems around the New Vegas area, specifically a network of missile defense systems that he controlled through his own computational infrastructure. When the bombs fell, these systems activated. They couldn't stop everything some warheads got through, and the surrounding Mojave shows the blast damage accordingly. But they stopped enough that New Vegas itself, the hotels, the casinos, the Strip survived largely intact, not untouched, but standing. House survived too, though the survival required its own extreme measure. His body, by October of 2077, was not in a condition to survive the post-war period without assistance. He had a degenerative condition, and he knew the bombs were coming. His solution was the life support pod in the Lucky 38 Hotel and Casino, connected to the city's infrastructure, maintaining his biological existence at minimum necessary function, while his mind continued to operate through the computational systems he'd spent years connecting to everything that mattered in New Vegas. 200 years later, he's still there, pale and diminished in his pod, but mentally undiminished, arguably more sophisticated, having had 2 centuries to refine his thinking and to observe the wasteland's development from a position of information advantage. He's been running New Vegas through the Securitron network since before most of its current residents were born. He recruited and organized the 3 casino families, the Chairmen, the White Gloves, and the Omertas, who now operate the major Strip casinos. He's been waiting for the chip that will allow him to fully upgrade his Securitron forces and move into the next phase of his plan. The next phase is, depending on how you read it, either the most ambitious or the most delusional plan in the Western Wasteland. House wants to restart civilization, not in the Wasteland way. Not building incrementally from what exists, he finds that approach too slow and too susceptible to the same failures that destroyed the previous civilization. He wants to build something new, using New Vegas as the base and the Securitrons as the workforce. Within a century, in his projection, New Vegas would be the center of a new civilization sufficiently advanced to develop space travel. Within 2 centuries, the new civilization would be establishing itself off-Earth, beyond the reach of the kind of planetary catastrophe that ended the old one. It's a genuine plan. He's thought it through. His reasoning is coherent. And there's something genuinely compelling about someone who survived the end of the world by sheer intelligence and preparation, and who has spent 2 centuries thinking about how to make sure it doesn't happen again. What House doesn't do, or doesn't do well, is ask the people whose existence his plan incorporates what they want. The Vegas families run their casinos according to his terms. The NCR is permitted to use the Mojave as a corridor because he's decided this serves his interests for now. The Legion is an annoyance to be managed. Individual people are, in House's framework, variables in a model, some of them interesting variables, some not, but none of them participants in the decision-making process. This is the limitation of genuine brilliance without genuine humility. House has no doubt about his calculations because his calculations have generally been good. He has no significant experience of being wrong at scale. And so the quality of his planning, which is excellent, doesn't compensate for the quality of his ethics, which is not something he spent equivalent effort on. The Securitrons are his vision of the future. Metal, programmed, loyal, efficient. They follow his orders without question because they don't have a mechanism for questioning. The civilization House wants to build looks, from a certain angle, a lot like a very well-run machine, and machines have no mechanism for asking whether the goals they're pursuing are the right ones. New Vegas under House's management is probably the most functional political arrangement in the Mojave. The Strip works, the casinos generate economic activity, the Mojave Express runs. The security is better than most of the Wasteland manages. If your metric is stability and function, House delivers. If your metric is something about what people owe each other, or about what civilization exists for beyond its own continuation, House is harder to evaluate. He's not cruel. He's not malicious. He simply has a model of what matters, and people's desires outside that model don't register as significant data. He's the last of the pre-war originals, the man who built a significant portion of the world's infrastructure, who predicted its end, who survived it through preparation and intelligence, and the willingness to do what it took to still be here. Looking at him, it's hard not to feel some mixture of respect and unease that doesn't resolve easily. He's also still in that pod, still pale, still running New Vegas through screens and Securitrons, 2 centuries after the world he built ended and left him behind in it. There's something quietly melancholy in that, once you allow yourself to notice it. Section 17. The railroad, those who walk in darkness. There are people in the Commonwealth who spend their lives moving in the dark. Not metaphorically. Actually in the dark, moving through tunnels and safe houses and the ruined infrastructure of a city that was one of the great metropolitan centers of the pre-war world, following a literal trail of marks scratched into walls and floors and the underside of bridges, living under assumed names, maintaining relationships that are built entirely around operational security and the possibility that the person you're talking to today might not be alive tomorrow. The railroad. The name is deliberate, and the reference is to the historical Underground Railroad, the network of routes and safe houses that helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the antebellum United States. The Railroad of Fallout 4 positions itself explicitly in this tradition. Its mission is to help synths who want to escape the Institute reach freedom, to extract them from the Commonwealth, provide them with new identities, and relocate them to places where they can live without being recovered. The ideological commitment of Railroad members is not uniform. Some of them believe that third-generation synths are definitively conscious beings with full moral status, entitled to the same protections and freedoms as any human person. Some of them operate on something less philosophically committed, a feeling that what the Institute does to synths is wrong, that the evidence of synth suffering is sufficient to require a response, even if the metaphysical questions aren't fully resolved. Some of them have personal stories, encounters with synths, that made the abstract political question concrete and personal. What all of them share is the willingness to make the operational commitment that this work requires, to spend their lives in hiding, to take operational names and keep operational secrets, to risk their lives on a regular basis for people who can't help them in return. This is not a glamorous existence. The railroad safe house in Boston, the Old North Church, which carries the historical resonance of 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, and the beginning of the Revolutionary War, is a converted basement, functional and austere. The members who use it are people who have learned to be in a particular kind of readiness at all times, who have internalized the habit of noticing exits and assessing threats and maintaining covers. Their work is also not entirely safe for the synths they help. The process of providing a new identity memory replacement, the railroad's technical capability that removes and replaces memories, is not without risk. The synths who go through it lose something. Whether that something is lost or transformed is a question the members of the railroad discuss, sometimes fiercely. Is a synth whose memories of their time with the Institute have been replaced with manufactured new ones the same person they were before the procedure? What do we owe someone whose sense of continuity has been deliberately disrupted in the name of their own safety? These are questions the railroad asks about itself, not always comfortably. Deacon, one of the railroad's most experienced and least readable members, is a person about whom very little can be verified. He tells the player character multiple different versions of his backstory, each plausible, none confirmed. He's been doing this work for years, possibly decades. He has a gift for disguise that suggests either extraordinary natural talent or extensive practice, and possibly both. He's also someone who has looked at the railroad's mission with clear eyes for long enough to have complicated feelings about it, who believes in the work and also sees its limitations and contradictions without letting those limitations and contradictions stop him from doing the work. Glory is a synth herself, who works as one of the railroad's primary field operatives. She's recovered enough synths to have the particular competence that comes from having survived a very large number of situations that could have gone wrong. She's also carrying the specific weight that a synth who has chosen to spend her freedom working for other synths' freedom carries, the question of what she owes to people like her, the ongoing negotiation between the life she could be living and the life she's chosen. The railroad's central philosophical commitment that synths are people is not one that the larger wasteland shares. The Brotherhood of Steel sees synths as machines, sophisticated machines, but machines. The Commonwealth settlements are mostly frightened of synths in a way that doesn't invite fine moral distinctions. Even some of the railroad's allies are uncertain about whether the commitment is philosophically defensible or just emotionally compelling. But the railroad keeps running. Not because the members are certain, but because the alternative, doing nothing while something that looks like suffering continues, is worse than acting on uncertain premises. They operate in the dark, scratching marks into walls, moving people from danger to safety, asking questions they can't fully answer and working anyway. There's something in that, in the willingness to act on moral intuition, in the absence of metaphysical certainty, to treat the evidence of suffering as sufficient reason to respond even when the status of the sufferer isn't philosophically settled, that the Fallout series presents with quiet respect. The work they're doing is the kind of work that the pre-war world failed to do, in various ways and for various populations. They are trying, in the rubble of everything, to do better. Section 18. The Great Khans and the Weight of History. There is a tribe in the Mojave Wasteland that carries its own destruction inside it. The Great Khans. The name sounds ancient, the kind of name that belongs to a people with a long history of nomadic power. And in the context of the Wasteland, it does belong to such a history, a direct lineage from the original Khans who appeared in the first Fallout game, a raider gang with aspirations that have over the years and the generations become something more complicated than simple raiding. The Khans of Fallout, New Vegas, are the inheritors of a catastrophic past. The Bitter Springs Massacre, an NCR military operation that killed a significant number of Khan, men, women, and children in what the NCR military claimed was a response to raider activity, but what many accounts describe as a disproportionate and indiscriminate response that targeted civilians, is the event the tribe lives in the shadow of. Not all the Khans alive in 2281 were there, but they all live in the aftermath. Papa Khan, the tribe's leader, has made alliances and decisions based on this grief and on this resentment. His rage at the NCR has made him willing to ally with Caesar's Legion, despite the Legion's well-documented record of doing to other tribes exactly what the NCR did to the Khans at Bitter Springs. This is the kind of psychological compromise that sustained trauma makes possible, the ability to accept as an ally, a force that embodies what you claim to hate because the object of your hatred is specific and your allies' targets are other people. The tribe itself is more complicated than Papa Khan's politics. The Great Khans have developed a pharmaceutical trade. They're skilled chemists, producing jet and other chems for sale throughout the Mojave. This gives them economic independence and a specific skill base that makes them valuable beyond their fighting capacity. Younger members of the tribe, particularly Jack and Diane in Vault 19, are trying to build the pharmaceutical operation into something that could be the basis for a more stable future. Among the most interesting Khans is a woman named Bitter Root, who, despite the tribe's history with the NCR, has joined the NCR's military and is serving alongside people she was raised to consider enemies. Her story is one of the many in New Vegas where individual choices complicate the faction narratives, where a person's decision to move across the tribal line reveals that the line was always more permeable than the faction. Rhetoric suggests the courier can, depending on their choices, help the Great Khans find a way forward that isn't defined by either old alliance. There's a faction ending available where the Khans leave the Mojave entirely, heading northeast to follow a historical route associated with their namesake, the Mongol expansion, the great nomadic movement across a continent. It's a bittersweet ending, full of the particular melancholy of a people who never found a home and are choosing, maybe, to stop looking for one in the wrong places. What the Great Khans represent in the broader Fallout universe is the persistence of history as wound. The thing that happened to them at Bitter Springs doesn't go away. It can't be talked through or diplomatically resolved. It lives in the tribe's culture, in its relationships with other factions, in the particular way its members understand themselves and their situation. Healing, if it happens, requires time and changed circumstances and choices that some members of the tribe are capable of making and others aren't. This is, in miniature, the problem of the entire wasteland. Every faction, every settlement, every individual survivor is carrying the weight of something that happened to them personally, to their people, to the world, and making decisions in the present that are shaped by that weight in ways they may not fully understand. The Great Khans are simply the case where this is most visible, where the wound is most recent and most legible. History is the heaviest thing in the wasteland, and unlike power armor, it doesn't come off. Conclusion. What remains in the dark? It's late now, wherever you are. The mysteries we've walked through tonight are not the kind that leave you feeling complete. The Fallout universe doesn't deal in completion. It deals in depth, the sense that wherever you look, there is more. That the stories embedded in its ruins reward the patient and the attentive with more stories, more threads, more questions that open onto more questions. The vaults are still down there. The experiments are still documented in their terminal logs, waiting for someone with enough persistence to piece the full picture together from what's been preserved. The Dunwich building still stands, and whatever looks back through the gap in the explanatory framework it represents is still there, too patient in ways that have nothing to do with human time. The mysterious stranger is somewhere just outside the frame of things, waiting for the world to slow down enough for him to step through it. The Mothman watches from the West Virginia tree line with its purple or its red eyes, carrying purposes that remain its own. The Sierra Madre broadcasts its pre-war invitation on a loop that has been playing for 2 centuries and will be playing still when everyone who hears it tonight is long gone. Joshua Graham is still in Zion, changing his bandages at dawn, doing better with what remains than most people could manage with easier materials. The courier is still walking. Probably people like the courier tend not to stay still for long. Nick Valentine is in his office in Diamond City, working the kind of cases that don't pay well but need working, carrying another man's grief in a chassis that was never designed for it and doing a remarkable job of it anyway. The Institute is dark. Now. Or should be, depending on which Fallout 4 ending you played. But the question it was built around, what is a person? What do we owe to conscious beings regardless of their substrate? That question is still very much alive. Not just in the Fallout universe, but in the actual world, which is going to have to answer versions of it sooner than most people are comfortable thinking about. The Great War happened because of 100 decisions made by people who thought they were making reasonable calculations. The war ended everything, and everything that exists in the wasteland is living in the aftermath. Every tradition adapted from the pre-war world, every theology constructed from the materials the apocalypse provided, every attempt to rebuild something recognizably civilized, all of it is happening in the shadow of what those calculations produced. The question Fallout keeps asking, the one that never fully answers itself, is whether the people walking through those ruins are capable of doing better, whether the second chance, if it comes, will be used differently than the first. The answer is, maybe. Probably. The evidence is mixed, and the universe is honest about that. But the people trying, the ones who build settlements and teach children, and maintain old machinery and negotiate instead of fight and choose mercy when cruelty would be easier, those people are doing something the pre-war world's greatest failures never quite managed. They're choosing, in specific circumstances, to act like the thing they're trying to become. That's the deepest note of the Fallout universe. Underneath the nuclear horror and the retro-futurist aesthetics and the dark humor and the genuine tragedy. It believes, stubbornly, that people making choices in the ruins of everything can accumulate those choices into something better. Not inevitably, not automatically, not without cost and setback and failure. But possibly, war never changes. But people do, sometimes, and sometimes the change is enough. Sleep well. The wasteland will be here when you wake up, just as complicated and just as full of stories as it was when you closed your eyes. If you enjoyed this, the like button means a lot, and the subscribe button means there's more where this came from. Long-form journeys through the strange and atmospheric corners of game universes that deserve more than surface treatment. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourself out there. End of script. Q plays. Bonus section. The Divide and the Language of Ruins. There are places in the Fallout universe where the landscape itself is telling you something. Most wastelands just exist. They're the result of nuclear devastation, rendered in the visual language of destruction, cracked earth, fallen buildings, the scattered evidence of what was here before and what happened to it. Their backgrounds, in a sense, even when they're beautifully rendered. The setting for stories rather than stories themselves. The Divide is different. When you enter the Divide in the Lonesome Road DLC, you enter a place that has its own voice. Not literally, there's no narration attached to the environment, but the landscape communicates. It insists on being understood as something more than background. The Divide was destroyed by nuclear detonations triggered by an unwitting delivery. The explosions were not from the Great War. They happened long after the war, in the period that the games call the post-war era, as a consequence of specifically human and specifically individual choices, which makes the Divide different in kind from the wider wasteland. The wider wasteland is the legacy of an almost impersonal catastrophe, a strategic exchange between nation-states, triggered by accumulated pressures and possibly automated systems, in which individual human agency is both present everywhere and diffuse enough to feel absent. The divide is the product of something smaller and more legible, a package, a delivery, a device that the person carrying it didn't understand and couldn't have been expected to understand, planted by someone who understood it perfectly. The landscape of the divide reflects this. It's more intensely broken than the ordinary wasteland. The electromagnetic storms that shred the flesh of anyone without adequate protection aren't natural, they're the residue of the specific kind of detonations that happened here, a permanent atmospheric consequence of what was done to this place. The Marked Men? The game's most horrifying faction in terms of simple visual presentation. Humans who have been flayed by the divide storms and kept alive by radiation, and by whatever stubbornness the human body can muster, are what happens to people caught here without protection long enough. Ulysses has been in the divide since before the courier arrives. He's been here long enough to know every corridor and every weather pattern, to have developed specific survivorship that keeps him alive in conditions that should be unsurvivable. He moves through the divide like someone who has accepted it, who has decided that this place, in all its ruin, is his, and that the person he intends to hold accountable for it will come to him here. The journey to reach him is a journey through your own past, rendered in landscape, the architecture of the divide. The remains of what it was before the explosions shows traces of the settlement that was growing here. Buildings in various stages of construction. Infrastructure laid for a community that was just beginning to become itself. The road signs point toward places that don't exist anymore, or that exist only as their own ruins. There's a particular kind of grief in unfinished architecture. A completed building that's been destroyed at least got to be what it was meant to be. A half-built structure, destroyed in the middle of becoming, carries the additional weight of what it never got to be. The divide is full of this weight. Every ruin in it is a ruin of possibility. Ulysses has built a camp near the end of the road. He's maintained it carefully, which tells you something about him, someone who takes care of his physical environment, even in a place as fundamentally inhospitable as this. He's been thinking about what he's going to say when the courier arrives. You can tell from the conversations that these are thoughts he's been refining for a long time, that he's considered and reconsidered the argument he's going to make. His argument is philosophical in a way that's unusual for a Fallout antagonist. He's not trying to conquer territory or eliminate an enemy population or restore a pre-war institution. He's trying to demonstrate a principle. The principle is that history is made by individuals, that the actions of a single person can produce consequences of civilizational scale, and that this fact has moral weight that ordinary ethics doesn't fully account for. The courier proved this principle, accidentally. By delivering a package whose contents they didn't understand, they destroyed a community that had been in the process of becoming something. If one person can do that much damage without intending it, what could one person accomplish by intending it? What could Ulysses accomplish by intending, specifically, the destabilization of the two largest political forces in the Western Wasteland? This is the argument. It's not entirely wrong. It's also not entirely right, and the space between those two assessments, the space where the courier has to decide how to respond, is where the Lonesome Road does its most interesting work. The road through the divide is the road back to something. Not to the divide itself, which can't be reconstructed, but to an understanding of what the courier's life has been and what it has meant, an understanding that was never available while the events were happening and is only available now, from this particular vantage point, looking back through ruins. Every road in the Fallout universe is, in some sense, the Lonesome Road. Every character is walking towards something they can't fully see and away from something they can't fully leave. The courier's journey is just the most explicit version of a structure that underlies all of it. Bonus section: the Brotherhood of Steel and the meaning of preservation. There is a faction in the Fallout universe that has decided that the most important thing left in the world is not people. The Brotherhood of Steel is one of the most recognizable elements of the Fallout franchise present in almost every game, immediately identifiable in their T-60 power armor, organized around a quasi-military hierarchy with a theology of technology at its center. They are the Knights of the Wasteland, as their own naming conventions suggest. Scribes who maintain knowledge, paladins who fight, elders who lead, and their central mission, as they understand it, is the collection, preservation, and controlled deployment of advanced technology. The Brotherhood originated in the final years before the Great War, as a group of U.S. Army soldiers stationed at Mariposa Military Base, the same installation where the FEV research was conducted. Under Captain Roger Maxson, who learned about the FEV experiments and the atrocities they represented, this group seceded from the United States military and retreated to a secure installation called Lost Hills in California. There, drawing on pre-war military organization and their experience with advanced technology, they developed into the Brotherhood of Steel. Their founding ideology was shaped by Maxson's horror at what unchecked scientific ambition had produced at Mariposa. The FEV experiments had created super mutants, had taken human beings and transformed them into something grotesque and dangerous for research purposes, without those human beings' consent or any accountability whatsoever. The lesson Maxson drew from this was not science should be more ethically constrained, but something closer to advanced technology is inherently dangerous in the wrong hands, and the Brotherhood's role is to determine which hands are wrong. This is a position that has enormous political implications that the Brotherhood doesn't always fully reckon with. They hoard technology, collecting it from wastelands, preventing other groups from accessing it, determining unilaterally what gets deployed and what gets locked away. They decide what the future of human civilization looks like by controlling access to the tools that civilization will be built with. In the West Coast Brotherhood, as portrayed in the original Fallout games, this creates a faction that has become deeply insular, more focused on the acquisition and maintenance of technology than on any broader human project. They'll help the wasteland if it serves their purposes. They won't help it when it doesn't. The technology comes first. The Capital Wasteland Brotherhood, under Elder Lyons in Fallout 3, represents a significant departure from this ideology. Lyons has decided that the wasteland's people matter in a way that the orthodox Brotherhood position doesn't accommodate, that the Brotherhood's technology and capability create an obligation to protect the vulnerable, not just an opportunity to selectively deploy power. The Capital chapter under Lyons fights super mutants and helps settlers in ways that the Western Elders explicitly disapprove of. Lyons is considered a heretic by some Brotherhood traditionalists. Fallout 4's Brotherhood, commanded by Elder Maxson, grandson of the founder's lineage, has swung back toward orthodoxy, but an orthodoxy with a specific paranoid edge. Maxson's Brotherhood is deeply invested in the elimination of synthetic life, treating synths as an existential threat regardless of the question of their consciousness or moral status. His fear is partly tactical. The Institute's synths represent an unknown quantity capable of infiltrating communities, and partly ideological, rooted in a view of humanity that treats genetic purity, in the absence of mutation, as a relevant category. The Brotherhood's relationship to technology is ultimately a displacement. They are trying to manage the risk that technology represents by controlling access to it, which doesn't address the underlying problem that human beings with access to technology will make choices about how to use it that no amount of preemptive collection and hoarding can fully control. The pre-war world had abundant technology and no shortage of Brotherhood-like attitudes, people, and institutions convinced that they should be the ones determining how it was used. The result was the Great War, which suggests that the Brotherhood's diagnosis is right. Advanced technology in the wrong hands is dangerous, but its solution is wrong. Concentrating control of technology in one faction's hands doesn't address what makes hands wrong. The Brotherhood is, in the Fallout universe, simultaneously heroic and limited. Their members are often individually admirable, loyal, skilled, disciplined, committed to something larger than personal interest. But the something larger they're committed to doesn't include everyone who needs to be included. And a vision of humanity that doesn't include everyone is, in the long run, not a vision of humanity. Bonus section. Memory, grief, and the weight of the before. There's a particular kind of haunting in the Fallout universe that doesn't come from supernatural sources or cosmic horror or the violence of the wasteland. It comes from the before. Almost every inhabited location in the Fallout games is in the ruins of something. Not just the ruins of buildings, the ruins of lives. The holotapes you find in abandoned houses describe the last hours of people trying to understand what was happening. The terminal entries in pre-war offices document the final weeks of people who had jobs and concerns and relationships that the bombs ended before they could resolve. The skeleton in the bathtub with the bottle of wine and the 2 glasses is a story that takes 3 seconds to read and stays with you for longer than most things. The Fallout games are, in one of their registers, an enormous archive of grief. The pre-war world is not entirely gone. Its records survive in the terminals and the holotapes and the books and the photographs and the advertisements. Its technology survives in functioning form: robots, generators, Pip-Boys, maintained by their own nuclear power sources, long past the point where anything biological would have failed. Its architecture survives, damaged and repurposed, but structurally present. The Capitol building in Washington, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Massachusetts State House. What doesn't survive is the context, the human texture that made all of this meaningful to the people who lived in it. The woman in the bathtub with the wine was waiting for someone who didn't come. The office worker in the file room was in the middle of a project that will never be completed. The child whose bedroom you find, with the worn stuffed animal and the construction paper drawings on the wall, never grew up. The games don't annotate this. They don't label the skeletons or provide explanatory text. They just show you the evidence of interrupted lives and let you supply the rest of the story, which is something the human mind does automatically and persistently. We see a skeleton and we build a person. We find a holotape and we hear a voice behind the words. We find a photograph and we imagine the lives around it. This is, in the end, what the Fallout universe does best. Not the gun mechanics or the faction politics or the crafting systems, though those have their pleasures. The thing Fallout does that no other gaming franchise has managed to replicate is the texture of its ruins. The sense of a world that was fully populated with people who had the full complexity of actual people, and that were moving through the aftermath of their having been here. The before haunts the after. Not as supernatural phenomenon, but as the ordinary, devastating weight of absence. The holotape in the fallen house, the child's drawing in the abandoned school, the love letter in the collapsed apartment, these are the ghosts of the Fallout universe, and they're more persistent than any supernatural entity. They're also the reason the question, does humanity deserve a second chance, lands as hard as it does. Because the answer isn't abstract. The people who need the second chance had names. They had photographs and holotapes and half-finished projects and wine waiting on the bathroom floor. They were not categories. They were specific. The Wasteland is asking you to keep them specific, to not let them become the generic past, the unavoidable backstory, the footnote to the survival story of whoever came next. To hold the fact that all of this happened to someone, that's a weight that never entirely lifts. And tonight, in the quiet of wherever you are, that weight is sitting with you. It should. End of script. Q plays. Bonus section. The Great War in detail. October 23rd, 2077. No one who was there to see it is alive in any ordinary sense. The 23rd of October 2077 is the specific gravity around which the entire Fallout universe orbits. Everything that the games explore, every faction, every ruin, every surviving piece of technology, every human adaptation, every cultural tradition assembled from the rubble is downstream of what happened on that Tuesday. It is the central event, the pivot around which the fiction turns. And yet we know almost nothing about it directly. What we have is context: the years of buildup, the resource wars, the Anchorage front, the diplomatic breakdown. We have aftermath: the immediate post-war period documented in Fallout 76, the longer post-war period documented in every subsequent game, the Wasteland's gradual reshaping over 2 centuries. We have the propaganda of both sides, which is to say, we have the stories that each government was telling its own people in the weeks before October 23rd, stories designed more to manage domestic anxiety than to accurately describe the geopolitical situation. What we don't have is the room where the decision was made, or the room where the mistake was made, if Tim Kane's vision of an automated failure is correct. We don't have the names of the specific people who were on watch when the systems activated. We don't have the transcripts of the final communications between Washington and Beijing in those last hours, if there were any communications at all. If the exchange happened so rapidly that communications were meaningless. The Chinese propaganda and the American propaganda agree on one thing: the other side struck first. The Chinese broadcasts that the player can find in Fallout 3 describe an American nuclear aggression. The American material describes a Chinese surprise attack. Both can't be true. Possibly neither is. There is a document in Fallout 4, found in the ruins of a government building, that comes as close as any in-game text does to suggesting what happened in those final hours. It describes a state of extreme alert at the highest levels of government. It describes communications that were breaking down. It describes decision-making under conditions of such extreme time pressure and such extreme uncertainty that the line between acting and reacting, had effectively dissolved. What it doesn't describe is a clear decision by a clear decision-maker to launch. What it describes is a system in the final stages of a failure cascade, not any single point of failure, but the accumulated pressure of many systems, each failing in small ways, the small failures compounding into a large one in the way that systems engineering teaches us they always can and sometimes do. The failure cascade model of the Great War has implications that the Fallout universe doesn't fully explore but that hover at its edges. If no one person made the decision, if the war was the product of systems rather than individuals, then the kind of accountability that fiction usually demands the villain behind the tragedy, the person to blame, isn't available. Which means the post-war quest for revenge or justice or reckoning is, to a degree, orphaned. There's no one to bring to account for it, because the thing that produced it was distributed, structural, institutional. This is arguably more terrifying than having a specific villain. A specific villain can be stopped. A structural failure, a civilization organized in ways that make catastrophe probable, requires something much harder. It requires the civilization to reorganize itself, to develop different institutional relationships with power and technology, to build accountability into its structures in ways that the pre-war world failed to do. Whether the post-war world is managing that reorganization, and whether it's doing it successfully enough to make the second chance meaningfully different from the first, is the question that all the faction conflicts in the Fallout games are exploring in their various ways. Every settlement that builds a functional governance structure, every trade route that maintains itself without devolving into raiding, every teacher who keeps a school operating, every doctor who treats people who can't pay, every person who makes a choice that prioritizes something beyond their own immediate interest, all of these are, in small ways, engaging with the question of whether the second civilization will be organized differently enough to avoid the first civilization's fate. The answer is not determined. The Fallout universe is honest about this. It doesn't promise that the second time will be better, and it doesn't pretend that the tendency toward the failures that produced the first apocalypse has been somehow removed from human nature. But it holds the question open, and it populates the wasteland with enough people making enough admirable choices to suggest that the question has an answer available, if the people working on it can find it. The bombs fell on a Tuesday in October. The world that existed before that Tuesday is gone, and the world that exists after it is still being built, one choice at a time, in the rubble of everything the first world left behind. That's the Fallout universe, and it's worth taking seriously. Bonus section: Little Lamplight and the Children in the Dark. Deep in the capital wasteland, through tunnels that most adults can't enter and in chambers that the surface world forgot about, there is a settlement called Little Lamplight. It is governed by children. Not accidentally, not as a temporary measure while waiting for adults to arrive and take over. Deliberately. By design, or rather, by an evolution of design. Little Lamplight began as a school trip, before the bombs fell, when a group of students was visiting the Lamplight Caverns when October 23rd happened. The teacher and the chaperones died in the initial chaos. The children survived in the caverns, which were deep enough and structurally sound enough to provide shelter from the worst effects. And then the children organized. They survived. They figured out, by trial and error and the particular adaptability of people who don't have established habits yet, how to grow food in the cavern, how to manage the resources available, how to maintain enough of a social structure to keep from destroying each other. They survived for weeks, and then months, and then the months became generations. The fundamental rule of Little Lamplight is this: when you turn 16, you leave. The settlement is for children. Adults called mungoists in the Lamplight slang are not permitted to stay. When a child reaches the threshold age, they are sent out into the wasteland. Some of them go to Murder Pass and through it to Big Town, a settlement of Little Lamplight graduates that operates under considerably more conventional rules. Some of them simply go into the wider world and don't look back. The rule seems cruel, from an outside perspective. Sending teenagers into the wasteland is not, by any objective measure, a policy that maximizes their chances of survival. But Little Lamplight has been running this policy for 200 years, and Little Lamplight still exists. The policy has something to recommend it beyond its outcomes. It has an internal logic rooted in the specific history and culture of the settlement. Little Lamplight is governed by Mayor McCready, who is 10 years old when the player encounters him in Fallout 3. 10 years old, running a community of approximately 50 children, managing the politics and the resource allocation and the social conflicts that any community generates. MacCready is, by any measure, extraordinarily competent for his age. He's also brittle in the ways that competent people who have been given too much responsibility too young are often brittle, quick to challenge authority, quick to take offense, compensating for a fundamental insecurity about whether he deserves the role he's been given. MacCready appears again in Fallout 4, grown, with a different name, Robert Joseph MacCready, the initials being a reference to the series' creator, and a different situation. He's a mercenary, working in the Commonwealth, carrying the grief of a wife killed by the Institute and a sick son who needs a cure he can't find. The 10-year-old mayor has become a man with a complicated relationship to the leadership instincts he developed young, trying to figure out what those instincts are worth in a world that doesn't need him to be a mayor. The continuity between these two versions of MacCready is one of Fallout 4's quieter pleasures. To see the person that the mayor of Little Lamplight grew into with the specific strengths and the specific damage that being that person entailed is to see the wasteland's particular version of growing up. Not the version that comes from a stable environment and appropriate support. The version that comes from necessity and isolation and too much responsibility at an age when the standard developmental framework says you should have other things to worry about. Little Lamplight itself raises questions that Fallout doesn't fully resolve. A settlement governed by children that ejects its members when they become adults. What is the politics of this system? What happens to the sense of self of someone raised in a community that will inevitably discard them? What does it mean to build a home you know you'll be forced to leave? The Lamplight graduates who populate Big Town don't seem, uniformly, to have been harmed by their origins, but neither do they seem entirely free of them. They carry the Lamplight in them in ways they may not fully understand. This is true of every formative community. What makes Little Lamplight distinctive is only the explicitness of its rules, the formal mechanism by which it shapes and then releases its members. Most communities operate on similar principles without making them quite so legible. Bonus section. The long night ahead. You're still here. Maybe you've been following every word. Maybe you drifted and let the tone carry you. Maybe you're somewhere between those states, half attending, half somewhere else. The way late nights work when you're tired but not quite ready to let go of the quiet yet. That's okay. The wasteland isn't going anywhere. Its stories keep. Fallout has been accumulating lore for nearly 30 years now. 30 years of terminal entries and holotapes and companion dialogues and side quests and environmental storytelling, and the occasional piece of main story writing that hits hard enough to stay with you permanently. The universe is vast in a way that resists summary. Every time you feel like you have the shape of it, you turn a corner and find another corridor, another room, another story embedded in the ruins that you didn't know was there. The mysteries we've spent tonight with the vaults and their deceptions, the Dunwich entity and its ancient wrongness, the mysterious stranger and his impossible persistence, the super mutants and the tragedy of their creation, the Sierra Madre and the love that built a death trap, the burned man and his bandages and his faith, the courier walking away from the divide, the Mothman's purple eyes, the horror of Tranquility Lane's sunshine, the Institute's cold logic and what it did to warm blood, the question of who fired first. These are only some of the stories, not even most of them. There are the alien signals and the crashed ships and the mystery of what exactly the Zatan species wants from humanity and why they keep coming back. There is the mystery of the prediction machine in the Institute, which deep agent data suggests has been modeling possible futures with unusual accuracy. There is the question of what's in the deep end, those concentric void rings where the terrain generation fails. There are the 6 stories of the Silver Shroud, the radio drama that Nick Valentine can lead the player through in Fallout 4, which is both a game within the game and a meditation on the role of heroic mythology in post-war culture. There is the Children of Adam missionary, who arrives in the glowing sea and talks to feral ghouls as if they can hear her, who maintains a small shrine in the most irradiated place in the Commonwealth, who believes that the ghouls are not mindless but transformed, waiting for something the rest of the world can't yet see. There is the sole survivor's spouse Nora, if you play as Nate. Nate, if you play as Nora frozen in their pod in Vault 111, murdered before they could wake, a grief that the main story of Fallout 4 builds its emotional architecture around, but that is also, in a sense, the grief of every player character in every Fallout game. The before taken away before it could be fully inhabited. There are so many more stories. There always are. The wasteland is generous with its secrets to anyone patient enough to look. So sleep now, if you're ready. The terminal logs will still be there in the morning. The voice near the obelisk will still be whispering. The mysterious stranger will still be just outside the frame. The stories keep, They keep very well. And the night that holds them, tonight, holds you too. Thank you for spending this time in the wasteland. If you made it this far, through all of it, the like button is there. Subscribe if you want more. The next one is in progress, another corner of a universe that rewards this kind of patient attention. More lore, more stories, more quiet hours in the ruins of something that was once alive. Good night. Take care of yourself. See you in the next one. End of script. Q plays. A note on the world these stories live in. There is a reason that Fallout's particular combination of retro-futurist aesthetics and post-apocalyptic content resonates so powerfully, and it has to do with a very specific emotional experience that the games create. The Fallout world is one where it is possible to know what was lost. In most post-apocalyptic fiction, the world before the apocalypse is either not depicted or depicted only abstractly. We know it was good because we're told it was good, or because the after looks so clearly diminished by comparison. We don't usually get to stand in the ruins of a specific place and piece together the specific life that happened there. Fallout gives us the terminals, the holotapes, the books still on the shelves of ruined libraries, the advertisements still playing on looping screens in malls where the stores have been looted and the shoppers are 200-year-old skeletons. The specificity of the loss is extraordinary. You can read the diary of the person whose bedroom you're standing in. You can hear the voice of the manager who recorded a training tape for employees who will never clock in again. This specificity is what makes the grief of the Fallout universe land differently than the grief of most post-apocalyptic fiction. It's not abstract. It's not a tragedy of civilization as a category. It's the tragedy of these specific people, documented in their own words, making their own decisions, living their own lives right up until the moment they weren't. The retrofuturism amplifies this. The 1950s aesthetic is not just a stylistic choice. It's a temporal displacement. It places the before in a period that is simultaneously recent enough to recognize and far enough away to feel like history. The chrome and the neon and the cheerful optimism all belong to a style that our cultural memory associates with a specific kind of American innocence, real or imagined. The feeling of a particular moment before certain disillusions set in, when the bombs destroy that world, when the chrome is charred and the neon is dark, and the cheerful optimism is visible only in the advertisement still playing to empty rooms, the loss is felt as the loss of that cultural moment extended forward into a future that never existed. A future that was somehow more innocent than ours, because it was organized around the aesthetic assumptions of a less complicated time. The fact that this innocence was always somewhat dishonest, that the pre-war world contained all the same tensions and failures that destroyed it, doesn't entirely undermine the feeling of loss. The feeling and the knowledge coexist, the way feeling and knowledge often coexist in the presence of things that matter. This is why the Fallout universe has sustained the attention and loyalty of its audience across nearly 3 decades, why it generates the depth of engagement that produces lore scholars and theory videos and hours-long discussions about the implications of a single terminal entry. The world it describes is richly imagined enough to hold all of that attention, and the emotional register it operates in grief and dark humor and occasional hope, in precisely the combination that real experience produces, is honest enough to keep that attention in good faith. The wasteland is a place you can care about, and caring about it, as we've done tonight, is a way of keeping alive the question it keeps asking, whether the people building in its ruins can do better than the people who left those ruins behind. The answer, still, is maybe? We'll know more tomorrow. For now, sleep. The mysteries will keep, and the night is patient. The wasteland stories breathe and wait for whoever needs them next. They always have.